Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you who listen to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, I'd appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the video and write the number of the story in the comments that you thought was the scariest. So let's go. I was never the type to believe in urban legends, but that night made me question everything I thought I knew. My friends and I were on our way back from a late-night drive, having taken the scenic route just to stretch our legs. The road was winding and dark, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to close in on us, swallowing any light from the moon. We weren't far from the small, sleepy town we just passed through, but it felt like we were in the middle of nowhere. The old, crumbling sign read Hollow Hill, a place my friend Isaac had joked about, saying it was where kids went to disappear. As we drove on, we noticed an old house, its silhouette barely visible through the trees. A chill ran down my spine as we slowed to a stop. It looked abandoned, but there was something about it that felt wrong. Its windows were dark, but one had a flickering light behind it, as if someone were moving inside. "Let's check it out," Isaac said, the excitement in his voice betraying the unease I felt. I hesitated, glancing at the others. Ella, our friend with a love for ghost stories, was already hopping out of the car. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sharp, metallic scent that made my stomach turn. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The wooden steps creaked under our weight as we approached the front door, its paint peeling and flaking like it would fall apart at any moment. Isaac knocked, and the sound echoed inside, loud and hollow. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the door swung open on its own, revealing the dark interior. Ella's flashlight flicked on, illuminating the warped floorboards and peeling wallpaper. Dust hung in the air like smoke, and the silence pressed down on us. We stepped inside, the old house groaning as if it were alive, warning us to leave. A sound came from upstairs, a faint thud, then the rhythmic creak of wood. My heart stopped, and I glanced at Ella. She looked back at me, eyes wide, but she didn't say a word. We were paralyzed with the sense that we weren't alone. "Maybe it's just an animal," Isaac whispered, but his voice sounded hollow, uncertain. I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could speak, the thumping came again. This time, it was louder, closer. We all turned to the staircase. At the top, a figure appeared, moving in jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet whose strings had been tangled. It was draped in a torn, filthy gown, hair falling in matted clumps around its face. And then, it tilted its head, and I saw that its eyes were black voids that seemed to look right through us. A scream bubbled up my throat, but I forced it down as we backed away. The figure started to descend the stairs, one step at a time, limbs bending in ways that were not possible. The hallway was plunged into shadows as Ella's flashlight quivered in her hand. "Run," I shouted, grabbing her arm and dragging her toward the door. Isaac was already halfway there, his face pale as he stumbled over the cracked floorboards. The figure's feet scraped against the stairs, nails dragging like iron on stone. We burst out into the cold night air, the house seeming to shudder behind us as if in rage. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, gasping and shaking. I didn't dare look back, but I heard the voice, low and echoing, whispering something that made my blood freeze. As we sped away, Ella clutched her flashlight to her chest, eyes wide and panicked. I glanced in the rearview mirror and thought I saw it standing in the window, watching, its face a blur of shadows and sickly white. We never spoke of that night again. But every time I pass by that stretch of road, I hear the creak of the old wooden steps and feel eyes on my back, waiting for me to turn around. The old town fair had been a staple in our small community for as long as I could remember. Every year, the rides would be set up on the outskirts of town, the air filled with the scent of popcorn and fried dough, and the sound of laughter mingling with the creak of the Ferris wheel. This year, though, something felt different. It was late, nearly midnight, and the fair was winding down. Most people had left, leaving behind scattered trash and the echoes of carnival music that still played, though no one was there to hear it. My friends and I had come to see the fireworks that always capped off the event, but now they were done, and the sky was dark and quiet, as if holding its breath. I was just about to suggest heading home when I noticed a woman standing by the old, run-down haunted house attraction. Her silhouette was stark against the dim lights, and she seemed to be staring at the entrance as if expecting someone. She was tall, almost unnaturally so, and her dark hair tumbled over her shoulders in waves that shone with an otherworldly glint. I couldn't see her face clearly, but there was something about her that made my skin prickle. "Hey, check that out," I whispered to my friend, Marissa. She glanced over and frowned. "Probably just some late-night worker," she said, but there was hesitation in her voice. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. Something was off. The haunted house had been closed for hours, and no one was supposed to be inside. I nodded toward it, and Marissa rolled her eyes, grabbing my arm. "Let's go home. It's late." But, as we walked away, I heard a faint giggle, so light and airy it could have been the wind. I glanced back over my shoulder, and the woman was gone. The front door of the haunted house was now ajar, creaking softly as it swung in the breeze. Marissa followed my gaze and stopped walking. "Did you hear that?" Before I could answer, the giggle came again, louder this time. We exchanged a look, and she whispered, "What if it's just a kid playing around?" "Then let's find out," I said, surprising myself with the boldness of my own voice. We approached the haunted house, the wooden planks beneath our feet creaking with each step. The smell of musty old wood and something metallic hit me as we stepped through the entrance, the dim lights casting shadows that seemed to move. Inside, everything was silent, except for the faint sound of breathing coming from deeper within. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt Marissa's grip tighten on my arm. "Are we really going in?" she asked, her voice small. Before I could answer, a sound like feet dragging across the floor came from behind us. I spun around, my eyes searching the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the deep, suffocating silence of an empty room. Then I saw it. A figure in the corner, hunched over, staring at us with eyes that glowed red in the dim light. The woman I had seen earlier, but now she was different. Her hair hung in tangled knots, and her mouth was open in a grin that was too wide. The edges of it split with what looked like stitched seams. "You're not supposed to be here," she whispered, voice cracking like dry wood. Marissa screamed, and we both bolted for the exit. As we ran, the air grew colder, and I could feel her presence behind us, her feet dragging, her laughter ringing out as if echoing from all corners of the room. We burst out into the open, gasping for air, and I didn't stop running until we were halfway home. The next morning, the fair was gone. The rides had been dismantled, and the ground was clear, as if the event had never happened. But when I passed the spot where the haunted house had stood, I noticed something chilling. A set of muddy footprints leading from the center of the fair to the edge of the woods, and one set that stopped at the edge and faced me, as if waiting for something that never came. The road to the old farmhouse was long and winding, a forgotten path that cut through fields of tall grass and gnarled oaks. I had never been out to the farm before, but my friend Aaron had convinced me to join him on this trip to visit his grandparents. They were out of town, and he thought it would be fun to spend the weekend there, exploring and getting away from the city that had started out as a joke between us, a way to break up the monotony of our usual weekend routine. But, as the sun sank below the horizon, the light slipping into dark shadows, an unease settled over me. The farmhouse stood on the edge of a field, its old wooden panels darkened with age. Windows that had once been bright and inviting now cracked and dusty. We explored the house in the fading light, peering into rooms filled with old, rusting tools and faded photographs of a family that felt like a ghostly memory. I touched a picture frame that showed a woman and a man with a young child, their smiles warm and familiar. But it was the eyes that made me stop. They looked familiar, almost like they were staring back at me. I quickly pulled my hand away, my heart hammering in my chest. Aaron laughed, his voice bouncing through the empty house. He was already upstairs, calling out for me to check out the attic. I hesitated, but curiosity won. I climbed up, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The attic was dark, suffocating with the scent of old wood and dust. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as if someone else was up there with us. "Look at this," Aaron said, holding a dusty lantern aloft. The light flickered, casting long, jerky shadows that seemed to move on their own. I stepped closer and saw an old, moth-eaten trunk. He opened it, and inside were old clothes, some toys, and a small diary with pages that looked like they could crumble with a single touch. I reached out and flipped it open, not expecting anything more than gibberish. But the words leapt off the page, written in a scrawled, frantic hand. They come when the lights go out. They were the faces of those who were here before. The air around me grew colder, and I heard Aaron let out a sharp breath behind me. The lantern flickered again, and I spun around, the light catching his face. His eyes were wide, and his mouth hung open, but it wasn't just surprise that I saw. It was fear. The wind picked up outside, rattling the old house as if it were trying to break in. A low thud sounded below us, and then a muffled voice, soft but urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, too close. My body tensed, and I felt a shiver race up my spine. "Aaron, we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But when I looked at him, he wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, something that moved in the darkened corner of the attic. I turned, heart leaping into my throat. The shadow moved, a shape that was impossible and familiar at once, a face. It had the same features as the one in the picture downstairs, but it wasn't a photograph anymore. It was real, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, lips twisting into a grin. I stumbled back, and the lantern fell from Aaron's hands, landing with a crash that shattered the glass and sent sparks skittering across the wooden floor. The room erupted into darkness, but I could still feel it moving closer, slow and deliberate. "Run!" Aaron shouted. We bolted down the stairs, tripping over each other in our panic. The voice below grew louder, now unmistakable a child's voice, singing a lullaby I had never heard before, followed by the soft sound of feet pattering on the floor above. We reached the front door, wrenching it open and stumbling out into the night. The moon was a pale slice in the sky, illuminating the fields that stretched out in front of us. We didn't stop to look back as we ran across the grass, the song still echoing behind us, chased by the sound of footsteps and a voice that whispered my name. When we reached the road, I dared a glance over my shoulder. The farmhouse loomed behind us, its windows dark and lifeless, but I saw something in the window on the second floor. A child's face, pressed against the glass, eyes wide and hollow, watching us as we ran away. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, hearts pounding and breathless. I never told anyone what happened that night, and Aaron never spoke of it again. But I know what I saw, and I know we weren't alone in that house, and I'm sure I'm not the only one who heard the voice. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear it. They come when the lights go out. The last thing I expected when I agreed to go on that evening hike with my cousins was to come back feeling like I'd been marked. We'd been talking about it for weeks, a hike up a familiar trail in the foothills, the kind that looked beautiful during the day, but took on a new life at night. The plan was simple: hike up, watch the sunset, and make it back before the real dark set in. We started at 6 p.m., the sun dipping below the horizon and painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The forest surrounding the trail was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of branches. I had always loved how the air smelled here, a mix of pine, earth, and the distant hint of rain. But tonight, there was something different. A faint metallic tang lingered in the air, like blood. We made it to the lookout point just as the sky turned dark. The view was breathtaking, twinkling lights of houses below, the vast stretch of trees rolling in waves toward the mountains. We stood in awe, taking in the moment. I pulled out my phone to snap a picture when I heard it, a long, low growl that made my skin prickle. I spun around, my heart thumping as my cousins exchanged nervous glances. It wasn't an animal noise. It was too deep, too deliberate. My cousin Clara let out a soft laugh. "Probably a bear," she said, though her voice quavered. But it wasn't a bear. We all knew it the moment we heard the footsteps behind us. Steady, deliberate, they came closer from the shadowy path. I glanced up at the dark trees, feeling that tight, familiar grip of panic. Should we go? My other cousin, Ben, asked. He was always the first to worry, but this time, we all felt it, an icy pull of something wrong. Before I could answer, a voice whispered from the dark, a voice so low that we could barely make out the words. "Leave now." It sent a cold shiver down my spine. The footsteps stopped. The whisper had come from somewhere nearby, but there was no one in sight. Clara's eyes darted around, her breath quickening. I felt trapped, my feet rooted to the spot. "Run!" Ben shouted suddenly, grabbing my arm. We bolted, tearing down the path, the forest closing in behind us like something alive, like something eager to reach out and snatch us back. Branches scratched at my skin, twigs snapped underfoot, and I could hear them more footsteps, faster now, in pursuit. I dared a glance over my shoulder and caught a glimpse of something moving, just a blur in the dark, something humanoid but twisted, with limbs bent at unnatural angles and eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. We didn't stop until we reached the bottom of the trail, gasping for breath and soaked in sweat. The distant growls had faded, and the air was still. I looked up to see Clara staring at me, her eyes wide and wild. "I heard it, didn't you?" she whispered, voice shaking. I nodded, too breathless to speak. We all stood there, waiting, the sounds of the forest returning to their familiar night song. But when we looked back at the trail, there was no sign of movement. No sign of whatever had been chasing us. As we walked back to the car, I noticed something hadn't before. The sky above us was completely clear now, the stars brilliant and sharp, but one of them wasn't a star. It was too close, too bright, and it pulsed, like an eye watching from the heavens. And then it blinked. We ran the rest of the way in silence, the sound of our breath and pounding feet echoing in the darkness. I knew then that whatever had been on that trail hadn't been a bear or some wild animal. And I knew that whatever had watched us that night wasn't finished. I never expected the library to be the place where I'd come face to face with something that defied explanation. It was just a typical Thursday evening, and I was there for a last-minute project. The library was almost deserted, the soft hum of the old heating system the only sound as I hunched over my laptop. My fingers drummed the keys in rhythm with the ticking of the clock. A sudden shiver ran down my spine. I paused, glancing over my shoulder at the empty reading area behind me. The room was dimly lit, the overhead bulbs casting long shadows over the book spines that lined the walls. I knew I shouldn't be there after hours, but deadlines don't care about rules. As I turned back to my work, I heard a faint whisper. I strained to listen, but it was too soft to understand. It sounded almost like a chant, like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. My eyes darted around the room, but everything seemed the same. No one there but me. I shook my head, trying to brush off the feeling. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. I snapped my laptop shut and stood up, my breath caught in my throat. The library's silence was now pierced by the sound of pages turning, a low rustling that seemed to come from the far end of the room. I took a step toward the noise, each footfall reverberating in the stillness. As I reached the aisle of old, forgotten history books, a sudden chill swept through the air, making my skin prickle. The sound of pages flipping came from behind the shelves, growing louder as if a hand were flipping them furiously. I could almost hear the words, murmurs mixed with a low, guttural growl. I edged closer, peering around the corner. There, in the shadowy alcove, a book lay open on the table, its pages flipping rapidly on their own. The words on the paper were jagged, black letters that seemed to move and writhe like insects. Before I could take a step closer, the book slammed shut with a noise that echoed through the building. I stumbled backward, almost falling over a chair. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't tear my eyes away as the library lights flickered and dimmed. I had to get out, but as I turned to leave, a sound stopped me cold. Footsteps, heavy and slow, like boots scraping against the wooden floor. I spun around, searching the dim light for any sign of movement. There was nothing, just the rows of books and the still, unblinking stare of the old portraits on the walls. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The footsteps came closer, and then a voice spoke, deep and rasping. It was coming from the direction of the table with the book. "You should not have come here." The voice was in my head, a whisper I felt rather than heard, curling around my thoughts like a snake. My eyes locked onto the table, and the book sprang open again, its pages still shifting as if alive. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something else. Someone. A figure, barely more than a shadow, standing at the entrance of the aisle. It had the shape of a man, but its face was a blank, featureless void. It tilted its head, as if examining me, and then took a step forward. The footsteps that had seemed distant before were now loud and heavy, echoing through the library as it advanced. I stumbled backward, and with one final, piercing screech of the fluorescent lights, the library plunged into darkness. The last thing I saw before I ran for the exit was the book on the table, its pages now still, bearing the words I'd never be able to forget. "You cannot leave." I threw open the front doors, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. The city was silent, the streets empty as I sprinted away from that place. I didn't stop until I was safely home, my chest heaving and my hands trembling. It wasn't until I reached my apartment that I realized my hands were still holding the library card, and I never saw it in my hand when I ran out the next day. When I returned to the library to find answers, it was closed. A sign on the door read, "Closed for renovations. Reopening unknown." But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of that shadowed figure in the window, watching me, waiting, and I knew I would never go back. The village was nestled between rolling hills and surrounded by dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where stories traveled faster than the wind, and where no one questioned the traditions that kept the community safe. Or so they thought. I had just moved to the village with my husband, hoping for a peaceful life away from the noise of the city. The people were welcoming, the scenery was beautiful, and the air had a crisp, clean smell. But there was always a whisper that wound its way through the market square, an undercurrent of unease. It was on a foggy afternoon that I first heard it. I had been in the village square, chatting with the baker when an old man passed by. His clothes were ragged, and his eyes seemed clouded, as if he had seen too much and too little at the same time. He muttered something under his breath, a chant that made my blood run cold. When the sun sets, the silence comes. And when the silence comes, they return. I didn't think much of it until I was out walking that evening, the sky turning deep purple and the forest casting long, wavering shadows. I took a path that led me through the woods, wanting to find a spot to clear my mind. The quiet was almost too much, pressing down on me, making my pulse quicken. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a deep growl coming from somewhere deep within the trees. I turned, but there was no one, just the maze of trunks and leaves. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a fox or a boar. I took a deep breath and pressed forward. The path wound tighter, the trees growing thicker. As the shadows deepened, I came upon a small clearing. The silence was so profound it almost hurt, and then I saw it, an old stone altar covered in moss and strange carvings. A chill ran through me as I stepped closer, brushing my fingers over the carvings. They were ancient symbols, twisted and unfamiliar. A sudden rustling made me spin around, eyes wide. A figure emerged from the woods, moving with an unnatural, jerky gait. It was humanoid but twisted, its limbs elongated and its face a pale, hollow mask with eyes that seemed to pulse in the dark. It opened its mouth, and the sound of a deep, bone-chilling howl ripped through the air. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, tripping over roots and falling hard. My head cracked against the ground, and the world blurred around me. The figure stood over me, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. Before I could scream, the howl came again, closer this time, and then another, and another, until the clearing was filled with the low, guttural chorus of those things that roamed in the dark. Suddenly, the silence shattered with the voice of the old man from the village. "The silence comes, and they return," he shouted from the edge of the woods, his voice frenzied. The creatures were circling me, eyes glistening, their breaths ragged and unnatural. They were closing in, but then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they stopped, their heads tilted back in unison, their mouths parting in a silent, screeching cry that sent a jolt of terror down my spine. And then I heard it, an ear-splitting, high-pitched sound that seemed to come from the forest itself. The creatures shuddered, their movements jerky and chaotic as they stumbled backward. One by one, they fell, as if yanked by invisible hands, their bodies crumpling into the underbrush. I scrambled to my feet, eyes wide, and looked around to see the old man standing there, his face pale and eyes wet with something I couldn't name. "They won't come back tonight," he said, his voice shaking. "But the silence always comes, and when it does, they are waiting." I didn't stay to ask questions. I ran, stumbling over roots and tripping over fallen branches until I broke through the tree line, gasping for breath. The village was still asleep, the sky slowly lightening as dawn approached. I glanced back, but the clearing and the altar were gone, swallowed by the woods as if they had never existed. For days, I tried to understand what I had seen, but the village folk never spoke of the old altar, the creatures, or the silence. They only whispered that when the sun set, the silence would come, and with it, they would return. And now I know why. Every time the forest falls quiet, my heart fills with dread. Because deep in the woods, the silence waits, and with it, something else waits too. The first time I noticed something was off was when I walked into the old public library. It was the middle of the day, yet the atmosphere was heavy and suffocating. The air smelled of dust and decay, with a hint of something sweet that I couldn't quite place. I usually loved the library, the hush of turning pages, the creak of wooden floors, the musty scent of old books, but that day felt different. I wasn't alone. A few people sat scattered among the aisles, some flipping through books and others simply staring blankly at the walls. I wandered past the rows of bookshelves, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead as if in sync with my growing unease. As I passed a section of history books, I heard a faint whisper. My pulse quickened, but when I turned, there was no one around. I let out a nervous chuckle and shook my head. I had been up all night studying. Maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on me. I moved deeper into the library, drawn to the old, oversized books in the corner. As I reached for one, a chill ran down my spine. The book was open, resting on a table, pages yellowed and stained. But it was the words that caught my attention. "Don't look behind you," I scoffed, dismissing it as some sick joke. But as I glanced over my shoulder, the whispering started again. This time, I heard it clearer, as though it was spoken directly into my ear. "Don't look behind you." I spun around, heart pounding, and locked eyes with an elderly man sitting across the room. He was hunched over, his gnarled fingers playing with the edge of a book, eyes glistening with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just the look in his eyes, it was the way he seemed to lean forward, as if trying to warn me. But his lips never moved. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the air, a rustling like pages being turned. I whipped around to see that all the books around me had fallen open, their pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze that I couldn't feel. A cold draft swept through the aisle, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something metallic. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. The man's voice came again, clearer this time, though still soft and broken. "You shouldn't be here." The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed off, plunging the room into a silence so deep it felt suffocating. I stood in the darkness, trying to convince myself it was just a power outage. My breathing echoed off the high ceilings as I reached for my phone, only to find the screen was dead. A soft, steady tapping began behind me, a rhythmic sound like fingernails on wood. I turned, and in the darkness, a thin, shadowy figure stood at the end of the aisle, just at the edge of the light from the window. Its eyes were wide and hollow, and a grin stretched across its face, too wide to be human. Panic surged through me, and I bolted toward the exit, stumbling through the rows of books as they fell around me. I could hear the whispering behind me, growing louder, weaving through the air like a song I couldn't recognize. I dared a glance over my shoulder and saw the figure moving toward me, feet gliding silently over the floor. I didn't stop running until I was out on the street, gasping for air as the sound of whispering finally faded. I dared to look back once, but the library was dark, as if nothing had happened at all. I swore I could still hear the faintest voice saying, "You should have listened," to this day. I never go near that library again, and when I pass it, I can still hear the soft, whispering voice calling out from inside, warning me of the one thing I wish I'd known. Once you hear the library's secrets, you can never leave. It was the last day of summer, and I decided to take a bike ride out to the old bridge. It was a spot I'd been to countless times before, but something felt different that day. The sun was setting, casting a blood-orange glow over the horizon, and the forest surrounding the path whispered in the warm breeze. I'd been riding for nearly an hour when I noticed the silence. The birds had stopped singing, and the crunch of gravel under my tires was the only sound. I slowed down, glancing around nervously. The woods felt alive, but not in a comforting way. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When I reached the bridge, I stopped to rest, propping my bike against the guardrail. Below, the river churned, swollen from weeks of rain. I leaned on the edge, staring down into the dark water, when I heard a faint splashing, as though someone, or something, was moving just below the surface. I squinted, trying to see. The sun was almost gone now, painting everything in shades of purple and indigo. I blinked, and then I saw it to pale, bony hands breaking the water, fingers clawing at the air. I stumbled back, nearly falling over my bike. A chilling, guttural moan rose up from the river, sending a cold wave down my spine. Before I could react, a figure burst out of the water, dragging itself up onto the bridge. Its skin was slick and glistening, half covered in river moss. Its eyes were wide and glassy, locked on mine with a stare that made my blood freeze. It moved with a lurching gait, limbs bending in impossible ways as it crawled forward. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. The creature reached out, its fingers twitching, and for a moment I thought it would grab me. But then, a sudden roar echoed through the woods, deep and primal. The creature paused, its head tilting to one side as if it could hear something I couldn't. It let out a sharp, piercing screech, then turned and sprinted back toward the forest, vanishing into the trees with a speed that seemed to defy logic. I stumbled backward, scrambling to my feet and grabbing my bike. Adrenaline surged through me, pushing me forward as I pedaled down the path. The forest was alive with rustling and snapping branches, as if a whole army of things were moving behind me. I didn't dare look back. The ride back was a blur, the world around me reduced to the thumping of my heart and the rhythmic screech of crickets. I finally made it home, slamming the door behind me, locking it as if it would somehow protect me from whatever had emerged from the river. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing the sound of water splashing, the shrill scream echoing in my mind. It wasn't until the next morning, when I opened my front door, that I understood the horror of it all. On my porch was a trail of wet, muddy footprints leading from the edge of the woods, where the bridge was, to my doorstep. And in the center of the prints was a small, pale handprint, smeared and barely visible, as if someone had tried to reach out but hadn't quite made it. The woods were still and silent again. But I knew, deep down, that whatever had been in the river hadn't left, and it was still watching. The summer evenings were always warm, but there was a strange bite in the air that night. I had been out for a late walk in the fields behind the old farmhouse. The path was familiar. I had grown up here, the creaking fence and the wildflowers like old friends. But tonight felt different. The crickets were silent, and the usual hum of nature seemed to be holding its breath. I reached the old well at the edge of the field, a spot I hadn't visited in years. The well was covered with a rusty grate, the metal bent and weathered. I paused, staring down into its dark mouth, half expecting to hear the splash of water or the distant drip of something unseen. Instead, I heard a low, rhythmic thumping. I stepped back, my heart pounding. It came from behind me, a sound like someone walking on dry leaves. I spun around, breath caught in my throat, but there was no one. Just the wind pushing the tall grass in ripples. I told myself I was being paranoid. But then I heard it again, soft steps, coming from the direction of the farmhouse. I took off running, faster than I had in years, past the fields and through the orchard. The branches of the apple trees clawed at my arms, and the air grew colder, the shadows deeper. I glanced back and saw nothing, but that thumping sound had followed me, close enough to make my pulse race. I reached the house, slamming the door behind me and bolting it shut. The old wood shuddered under the weight of my panic. My grandmother's clock ticked on the wall, its second hand moving with a deliberate slowness, mocking me. I forced myself to catch my breath, trying to convince myself it had just been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog. I was just about to turn on the radio to break the silence when I heard it. The thumping had stopped. Now there was a slow, dragging noise, as if something heavy was being pulled across the porch outside. I froze, listening. The sound came closer, pausing right at the front door. I glanced around the room, searching for something to defend myself with. My fingers found the edge of a heavy iron candlestick, and I gripped it tightly as the sound moved from the porch to the side of the house. I could hear breathing now, shallow and ragged, like something was trying to catch its breath. The silence returned, broken only by the beat of my heart and the ticking of the clock. I dared to look out the side window, the one that faced the barn, and I saw a shadow moving in the moonlight. It was too big to be a person. It was the unnatural dot. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open, and for a split second, I could see a dark figure standing there, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an impossible angle. The shape tilted its head up to look at me through the window, and even from a distance, I could see the smile stretched wide across its face, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. I stumbled back, the candlestick clattering to the floor. My grandmother's voice echoed in my head, "Never turn your back on the dark," but that was impossible now. The creature moved forward, and the air grew cold as frost started to creep along the window pane. A sudden crash from the front of the house made me spin around. The door splintered as something slammed into it, but the lock held. I could see the creature at the window now. Its eyes locked on mine, black and wet like oil. It reached out, fingers stretching in impossible ways, scraping against the glass with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. The clock stopped, mid-tick. The room went dark, the silence deep and suffocating. Then, I heard the voice, soft and hollow, like it was coming from under the floorboards. "Let me in." I took a deep breath and bolted for the back door, grabbing my coat and running out into the night. The wind picked up, and the sound of the creature behind me was drowned out by a roar like 100 voices crying out at once. I didn't look back until I reached the road, my legs trembling and my chest burning. I glanced over my shoulder, but the house was empty, silent once more, and the field behind it was blanketed in shadows. I didn't stop running until I reached town, and even then, I never spoke of that night to anyone. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure: it was waiting for me, and it was only a matter of time before it came back. I didn't believe in ghosts. I never had. That was, until the night I spent in the old farmhouse. It started as a dare, a stupid bet among friends. Spend one night in the place everyone whispered about, but no one dared to enter. They said the last family to live there had vanished. No one knew why or how. The house had sat empty for years, with broken windows staring out like blind eyes. I arrived just before sunset, armed with a flashlight, a fully charged phone, and a backpack stuffed with snacks and a blanket. The place looked worse up close, with ivy choking the sides and rot eating at the doorframe. Inside, the air was heavy, stale, and suffocating, carrying a faint metallic tang. Every creak of the floor under my boots echoed like gunfire in the silence. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I stayed in the living room, scrolling through my phone to distract myself. The furniture was old and mismatched, covered in a thick layer of dust. A grandfather clock stood in the corner, its face cracked, hands frozen at 3 minutes past midnight. That should have unsettled me more than it did. At around 10 p.m., the noises began. It started subtly, a faint tapping, like fingers on glass, coming from the upstairs windows. I tried to convince myself it was the wind, though the trees outside were completely still. The tapping grew louder, then stopped. Just when I thought it was over, I heard something new. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy steps creaking across the wooden floor above me. My breath caught in my throat, and my flashlight trembled as I pointed it at the ceiling. The footsteps moved toward the staircase. I braced myself, expecting to see something horrifying emerge, but nothing appeared. The steps stopped abruptly, halfway down the stairs. I shone my light up the staircase, illuminating empty space. I told myself it was the house settling, that old wood creak like that, but deep down, I knew better. Just after midnight, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. The air grew icy cold, and my breath puffed out in white clouds. I heard whispers, too faint to make out words, but unmistakably human. They came from the corners of the room, from the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. My heart pounded as I spun in circles, trying to find the source, but the whispers moved, always staying just out of reach. That's when I saw the painting. I hadn't noticed it earlier, but it hung above the fireplace, depicting a man, woman, and 2 children. The family stared out with unerringly blank expressions. I swore their eyes followed me as I moved. Then, the woman's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. I stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table, and my flashlight beam flickered. When the light steadied, the painting was just as it had been, the faces frozen in their original stoic expressions. I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my backpack and headed for the door, but the door wouldn't open. The knob turned, but it was like something was holding it shut. I heard laughter then, soft at first, then louder, echoing around me. It sounded like children, their giggles high-pitched and wrong, as though they came from tiny throats filled with static. The laughter stopped abruptly. I turned to find myself face to face with a woman from the painting. Her eyes were empty sockets, her smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing too many teeth. My scream caught in my throat as she raised a bony finger and pointed upstairs. I bolted to the window, smashing it open with a chair. Just as I climbed out, the whispers returned, growing louder, a cacophony of voices screaming at me to stop. I hit the ground running, not stopping until I reached my car. When I turned to look back, the house stood in eerie silence. I drove away, promising myself I'd never return. But as I sat in my room later, that night, staring at my reflection in the mirror, I noticed something strange. The mirror was too dark. The reflection too slow. It wasn't me staring back anymore. It started as a quiet night, the kind where you feel the weight of the silence pressing against your ears. I was dog-sitting for a friend at their house in the countryside. They had warned me it could get lonely out there, surrounded by nothing but trees and open fields, but I had shrugged it off. I enjoyed solitude, and I wasn't afraid of the dark. I was wrong. The house was small, cozy, with large windows that overlooked the woods. The dog, a large shepherd mix, had been restless all evening, pacing near the back door. I figured he just missed his owners. The night stretched on uneventfully. I fed him, let him out into the yard for a while, and finally settled on the couch to watch some TV. Around 11, I heard the first sound. It was faint at first, like something wrestling against the side of the house. I muted the TV and listened, but everything had gone silent. I chalked it up to the wind. Living in the city had dulled my sense of how noisy the countryside could be. The dog, however, didn't seem convinced. He stood in the middle of the room, ears pricked, staring at the back door. It was unnerving, but I brushed it off. I called him over, and he reluctantly lay at my feet. I tried to focus on the show, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The house felt colder, as if the warmth had seeped out through invisible cracks. At midnight, the sound came again. This time, it was louder. It wasn't just rustling. It was a deliberate, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground outside. I stood up, my pulse quickening, and walked to the back door. The dog followed, his fur bristling. I flipped on the porch light. The yard was empty, the woods beyond it still and dark. The sound had stopped. I scanned the tree line, but saw nothing unusual. Taking a deep breath, I stepped outside to get a better look. The cold air stung my skin as I peered into the shadows. That was when the dog began to growl. A low, guttural sound that I had never heard from him before. His eyes were fixed on the far corner of the yard, where the light didn't quite reach. I followed his gaze, my heart hammering in my chest. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A tall, misshapen figure stood at the edge of the trees, barely visible. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound. I blinked, and it was gone. My rational mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe I had imagined it, maybe it was just a shadow. But the dog's growl deepened, and his body tensed as if ready to pounce. I backed into the house, locking the door behind me. The dog barked once, sharply, then fell silent. I tried to calm myself. I told myself there was nothing out there, that my imagination was running wild. But the unease didn't leave me. I decided to stay awake, just in case. Hours passed, and the night grew colder. The dog had settled at my feet again, but his ears twitched at every creak and groan of the house. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of knocking. It was soft but insistent, coming from the back door. The clock on the wall read 3 in the morning. My heart raced as I got up and crept toward the door. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate. I glanced through the window but saw nothing. My hand hesitated on the doorknob. Then the knocking stopped. A moment of silence followed, then a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper. but I could hear it clearly. "Let me in." My blood turned to ice. The voice was familiar. It was my own. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The dog began barking furiously, his body pressed against the door as if trying to protect me. The voice came again, louder this time. "Let me in." The doorknob rattled, and the dog's barking grew frantic. I didn't know what to do. My hands shook as I grabbed a flashlight and shined it out the window. The yard was empty. The voice stopped, and so did the dog. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I went outside to look for any signs of what had happened. There were no footprints, no disturbed soil, nothing. But as I turned to go back inside, I noticed something on the door. Scratched into the wood, deep and jagged, were the words I had heard all night. "Let me in." The dog refused to go near the door for the rest of the day. Neither of us ever stayed in that house again. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. I always thought those stories were just exaggerated tales meant to scare kids. But that night changed everything. It started with a simple favor. A friend had asked me to house sit for the weekend while they were out of town. The house was old, a sprawling Victorian home with creaking wood floors and a reputation for being haunted. I laughed it off at the time. It was just a house. The first night passed uneventfully. I watered the plants, fed their cat, and binge-watched a few shows. The house had an eerie charm, with its antique furniture and dim lighting, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. On the second night, things started to feel off. The cat, normally calm and aloof, began acting strangely. She refused to stay in one room for long and hissed at empty corners. I dismissed it as animal behavior, though I couldn't shake the feeling of unease creeping over me. Later that evening, while I was reading in the living room, I heard what sounded like footsteps upstairs. It wasn't subtle or distant. It was deliberate and heavy, as if someone was pacing back and forth. My chest tightened. The house was supposed to be empty. I stood frozen for a moment, listening as the sound stopped. Summoning my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the staircase. With each step up, the air grew colder. I tried to convince myself it was just an old house settling or my imagination running wild. The whole way upstairs was dim, the single light bulb flickering weakly. I walked toward the source of the sound, a guest room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I felt a cold draft coming from inside. The room was empty, no intruders, no signs of anything out of place, yet the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I heard a third behind me, back toward the staircase. Whipping around, I shone my flashlight down the hall but saw nothing. My pulse was racing as I checked each room, finding nothing unusual. I finally decided I was overthinking it and went back downstairs, locking the bedroom doors behind me for good measure. That night, I struggled to sleep. The house was too quiet. Every creak of the floorboards made my nerves jump. At some point, I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like a breeze, but unmistakably human. My heart pounded as I strained to hear the words. It seemed to be coming from the corner of the room near the window. I sat up, clutching the blanket, and turned on the lamp. The whispers stopped instantly. The room was still, but I could feel the hairs on my neck standing on end. I looked toward the window, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw a figure standing outside. It wasn't clear, just the outline of something tall and motionless. I blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe I was just overtired, or maybe it was the wind outside. Determined not to let fear get the better of me, I decided to check the entire property in daylight. Nothing seemed out of place until I opened the basement door. I had avoided the basement all weekend. Something about it felt wrong, like a part of the house that didn't belong, but now I felt compelled to go down there. As I descended the creaky steps, the musty smell grew stronger, and the light barely illuminated the space. It was cluttered with old furniture and boxes, but in the far corner, something caught my eye. A tall mirror stood there, covered in a heavy sheet. I approached it cautiously, unsure why I felt so drawn to it. Pulling the sheet away, I stared at my reflection. For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then, my reflection smiled at me. I didn't smile. I froze, watching as the image in the mirror tilted its head, studying me with a look of amusement. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the reflection stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass as if it were trying to come through. I ran up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was outside, breathing in the fresh air as if I had been drowning. My friend returned the next day, and I told them I couldn't stay there again. I didn't mention the mirror. Weeks later, they called to tell me the strangest thing. The mirror in the basement had shattered on its own. But what really made my skin crawl was the discovery underneath the shards. Scratched into the wooden frame was my name, carved over and over again. It started on a late autumn night when a friend and I decided to explore an abandoned house just outside of town. It had been empty for decades, the kind of place that fueled urban legends. People whispered about lights flickering in the windows and strange noises coming from inside. Naturally, we were curious, the way only young people, with nothing better to do, could be. The house was enormous, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of neglect. The windows were broken, and the front door hung on rusted hinges. We had brought flashlights, but I remember the beams barely cutting through the dense darkness inside. The air smelled of mildew and rot. Leaves crunched underfoot as we stepped onto the warped floorboards. The entryway opened into a cavernous living room. Furniture draped in white sheets stood like ghosts in the gloom. A grand staircase loomed to the left, its banister coated in cobwebs. We agreed to start upstairs, feeling braver together. The steps groaned beneath our weight, each creak reverberating through the empty house. As we reached the landing, I noticed the unsettling silence. No wind, no animal sounds. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist. The first few rooms were empty, just peeling wallpaper and broken glass. But the third door was different. It was shut tight, unlike the others that swung open with ease. I felt a strange resistance when I turned the knob, as if something was pressing back from the other side. My friend joked that it was probably swollen from the damp, but I could see he was uneasy too. When the door finally gave way, it revealed a small bedroom. The walls were painted a faded pink, and a child's bed frame sat against one wall. But what drew my attention was the dresser. Its mirror was intact, unlike the broken shards scattered throughout the house. As I stepped closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. In the reflection, the room wasn't empty. There was a figure standing in the corner. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by shadows. I spun around, flashlight sweeping the corner, but there was no one there. I glanced back at the mirror, and the figure was gone. My friend had seen it too. He was pale, his flashlight shaking slightly. Neither of us said a word, but we backed out of the room. Shutting the door firmly behind us, we decided to leave, suddenly feeling like we had overstayed our welcome. As we descended the staircase, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing. The house seemed darker now, the air heavier. Just as we reached the front door, we heard it. A loud crash from upstairs, as if something heavy had fallen. My friend looked at me, his eyes wide. Against my better judgment, I suggested we check it out. I didn't want to be the person who ignored something like that, only to regret it later. We crept back up the stairs, every creak of the wood amplifying the tension. The crash had come from the same bedroom. This time, the door was slightly ajar. Pushing it open, we found the room exactly as we had left it except for the mirror. It was shattered, shards of glass littering the floor. The frame was twisted, almost as if it had been torn apart by something stronger than human hands. I knelt to pick up a shard, curiosity overriding fear. That was when I noticed something chilling. The pieces of glass reflected not just us, but the entire room except for the space behind us. It was blank, a void where the rest of the room should have been. I dropped the shard and stumbled back, my breathing ragged. That was when we heard the whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. A single word, drawn out and raspy. Leave. It didn't sound like a plea or a warning. It sounded like a command. My friend didn't wait. He bolted down the stairs, and I was right behind him. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for air. The house stood silent and still, its dark windows staring back at us. But, as we turned to leave, I saw something in the upper window. A shadow. Unmoving. Watching us. We drove back to town in silence. neither of us wanting to talk about what had happened. But later that night, as I lay in bed, I noticed something chilling. The mirror in my bedroom, which I had owned for years, had a crack running through it. And in that crack, faintly, I could see the outline of a figure. I'll never forget the night my friends and I decided to take a trip to that abandoned house. It wasn't a grand plan. We were just a group of college students looking for something to do on a Saturday night, and when someone mentioned the old mansion at the edge of town, we all jumped at the chance. It had been sitting there, untouched, for years, just a hulking structure, faded by time and nature, covered in stories we had all heard but never truly believed. Everyone said it was haunted. Everyone said we were crazy to go. But of course, that only made it more tempting. We packed flashlights, snacks, and a camera for good measure. After a short hike through the overgrown path that led to the house, we finally arrived at the front door. It was exactly as we'd imagined, creaky, ancient wood with rusted metal hinges. The windows were boarded up, and ivy crept over the stone walls like it was trying to pull the house back into the earth. The kind of place you'd expect to be in a horror movie. We laughed nervously as we pushed the door open. The smell hit us immediately: mildew, dust, and something more metallic, almost like old blood. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a long hallway with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered everywhere. We joked about how eerie it looked, but even I could feel the chill in the air, a sense of heaviness that made every step feel slower than it should. We decided to explore the house room by room, each more unsettling than the last. The living room was filled with shattered glass, and the dining room had a long table covered in rotting remnants of food that had long since turned to mush. There was an overwhelming sense that time had stopped here, that the place was frozen in some terrible moment, but we didn't stop. It was all part of the fun until we found the staircase. At the top of the stairs, the air felt different, colder. We shone our lights around, and that's when I saw it, a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. I felt a knot form in my stomach, a sudden urge to turn back, but curiosity won out. I led the way. The room behind that door was much smaller than the others, barely furnished except for a single rocking chair in the corner. It faced the wall, but something was odd about it. The floor around the chair was covered in what looked like old, faded chalk marks. I moved closer to get a better look, but then the air shifted. A loud creak echoed through the room, so loud it made my heart skip a beat. The chair moved just slightly at first, as though someone had shifted their weight in it. I froze. My friends looked at me, unsure of what to say. One of them whispered, asking if I had touched it. I hadn't. We all gathered near the door, the tension mounting, as the chair began to rock back and forth, slowly at first, then faster, as though something or someone was pushing it from behind. That was when we heard it, a low, almost imperceptible whisper. Leave. I didn't know if it was the wind, my imagination, or something else, but the voice was unmistakable. It was as though it came from all directions, vibrating through the walls and the floor. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. The chair stopped. For a split second, I thought maybe we had imagined everything. But as I turned to leave, my flashlight beam caught something, a reflection in the cracked mirror on the wall. It wasn't mine. A figure stood behind me, its pale face twisted in a grotesque, unnatural grin. I whipped around, but no one was there. My breath caught in my throat, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The door slammed shut. We screamed, racing to get out, the floor creaking beneath our feet as we sprinted back down the hall, stumbling over the debris in our panic. As we finally reached the bottom of the stairs, the air felt thick with something cold and suffocating. I was the last to reach the door, and just as my hand touched the handle, I heard it again, that whisper, "Leave now, or you'll stay." I yanked the door open, and we spilled into the night air, gasping for breath, hearts pounding in our chests. The house stood silent behind us, a dark silhouette against the moonlight. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town, each of us too scared to speak, too shaken to process what had just happened. When we got home, we tried to laugh it off. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, something that didn't want us to leave. That night, as I was about to fall asleep, I checked my phone, and that's when I saw the message. It was from a number I didn't recognize. The text was simple, chilling. "You left too soon. I couldn't breathe. I never thought I'd be one of those people who would have something to say about a haunting. I've always been skeptical, dismissing strange noises or feelings as the result of stress or overactive imaginations. But that weekend, my beliefs changed forever. My friends and I had rented an old house for a quiet weekend getaway. It was isolated, surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place you can only reach by a long, winding road. When we arrived, the house looked just as we expected, charming, old-fashioned, with creaky floors and antique furniture. Nothing about it seemed unusual at first. We spent the day exploring the area, taking in the fresh air, and enjoying the solitude. By dusk, we were back inside, sitting around the large fireplace, talking and laughing. As night fell, the atmosphere in the house changed. It was subtle at first, a slight chill in the air, the fire flickering, and then the sound started. At first, it was just creaking, a few odd noises from the floorboards above us. I didn't think much of it. Old houses are known for settling. But, as the evening wore on, the noises grew more distinct. There were footsteps, heavy and deliberate, pacing across the floor above us. I looked at my friends. They were all chatting, oblivious. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I stayed quiet, trying to convince myself that it was just the house. But the footsteps didn't stop. They went on for minutes, circling the room above, like someone was pacing around up there. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stood up, telling my friends I was going to check upstairs. They laughed it off, assuming it was just the wind or the house settling. But as I made my way up the narrow stairs, my heart pounded harder with every step. The air grew colder, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. When I reached the top of the stairs, the house was silent. To silent, I moved down the hallway, checking each room, but there was no one there. No sign of any movement, just the eerie silence of the old house. I thought I was being paranoid, but as I turned to head back to the stairs, I saw it. A door, slightly ajar, at the far end of the hallway. It hadn't been open when I first came upstairs. I froze. The footsteps, the creaking, all made sense now. Something or someone had been up here. My breath hitched as I approached the door. I reached out to push it open, and just as my fingers touched the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I staggered back, nearly falling down the stairs in shock. I ran downstairs, shaking, and told my friends what happened. They didn't believe me, of course. They joked about it, but something in my gut told me we weren't alone. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the walls made me jump. I stayed awake, staring into the darkness, waiting for whatever it was to make itself known. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it, a soft knock on my bedroom door. My blood ran cold. I held my breath, too terrified to move. The knock came again, louder this time. I slowly rose from the bed and approached the door, but as I reached for the handle, I heard a whisper, "Let me in." I froze. The voice was unmistakable, a low, raspy whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to send a chill straight through me. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away and huddled in the corner of the room, my heart racing. The knock came again, followed by the whisper, now louder and more insistent. "Let me in." I must have stayed in that corner for hours, too terrified to move, until the sun finally rose. When morning came, I thought it was over. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but when I went to check the door, it was ajar, just like the one upstairs the night before. I didn't say anything to my friends. They were still asleep, oblivious to what had happened. But, as we packed up to leave, I noticed something strange. A small, almost unnoticeable handprint on the doorframe, tiny, but clear enough to make my stomach churn. We left that morning, never speaking of what happened. I still don't know what it was, but every time I close my eyes, I hear that whisper in my ear, "Let me in." A few friends, a remote location, and no distractions, just the way we wanted it. The cabin was a little older than we expected, but it had character. We arrived just before sunset and spent the evening laughing around the fire pit, exchanging old stories. The atmosphere felt peaceful, but as the sun set, a strange quiet settled in, the kind of silence that feels too heavy. I chalked it up to the isolation, but a creeping sense of unease grew as the night wore on. We retired to our rooms after a while. My room was upstairs at the end of a narrow hallway, and I felt an odd tension the moment I closed the door behind me. The sounds from the house would creaking. The wind outside were expected, but then I started hearing something else, a tapping. Faint at first, like someone knocking softly on the door, followed by a dragging noise. I froze, heart pounding. I was certain it wasn't the wind. I lay still, trying to listen. Another tap. Then something that sounded like fingernails scraping against the door frame. My skin prickled. I had to get up, but I didn't want to. My hand hovered over the door handle, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I waited, trying to tell myself it was just the house settling. The noise stopped. For a long time, there was nothing, and I convinced myself it was over. But just as I thought I might be able to sleep, there came a voice, soft, almost a whisper. "Let me in," I nearly screamed. The voice sounded too close, like it was coming from just outside my door. It wasn't a prank. I knew that much. I could feel it in my bones. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I sat against the door, every part of me screaming to run. I glanced around the room, searching for something to use as a weapon. But I couldn't bring myself to open the door. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I don't know. Eventually, the knocking stopped. The voice didn't return. I tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, I found my friends already downstairs. They were chatting, completely unaware of the events from the night before. I didn't mention it. Who would believe me? Instead, we spent the day exploring the surrounding woods, trying to forget the oppressive silence that had followed us all night. Later that evening, we sat around the fireplace again, talking casually. But the nagging feeling returned. The wind outside was picking up again, howling through the trees. As we chatted, I noticed something odd. There were scratch marks on the door frame. I hadn't seen them before. But there they were, deep. Jagged gouges like something had been clawing at the door. I tried to shake it off, but as the night went on, the air grew thicker, colder. Then, at exactly midnight, a sudden loud bang shook the cabin. My heart stopped. It sounded like something or someone had struck the door with force. We all froze, staring at the door as if waiting for it to open. Mark, who had been the most skeptical, stood up slowly. "I'll check it out," he said. We didn't stop him. It was stupid, but in the moment, we were all too frozen to act. He opened the door, stepped out into the hallway, and looked around. There was nothing there, no one, just an empty corridor. He turned to look back at us, his face pale. "You're not going to believe this," he said quietly, confused. We all moved into the hallway to see what he was talking about. The door frame was covered in fresh, deep scratches. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the door was a handprint. It was smeared in something dark, something that didn't belong. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't paint. It looked like blood. None of us said anything at first. The air felt heavy. I glanced down the hallway, my blood running cold. The door to the attic, which had been closed earlier, was now ajar. A faint light flickered inside. Without thinking, I moved towards it, my steps slow and hesitant. We had to know what was happening. The others followed me, but no one spoke. As I approached the attic stairs, I heard something that froze me in place, the sound of someone breathing. Shallow, ragged breaths, from inside the attic. I turned to the others, and Mark motioned for us to stay quiet. He approached the stairs and slowly reached for the light switch. The attic light flickered on. We waited, breath held, as the shadows parted to reveal an empty room, except for one thing. In the far corner, there was a full-length mirror. I hadn't noticed it before, and as I looked into it, I saw something that made my heart race. Standing behind us, reflected in the glass, was the unmistakable figure of a woman. A pale, gaunt figure with hollow eyes, but no one else saw her. In the room. Just in the mirror. Suddenly, the house seemed to shudder as if it had come alive. The mirror cracked, and then everything went black. We ran. We didn't stop until we were far from the cabin, hearts still pounding, and we never spoke of that night again. I never thought I'd be one to experience something unexplainable. My friends and I were always practical, skeptical, but one weekend trip, far out in the woods, changed everything. We rented a small, isolated cabin. The kind you see in movies where people go to get away, only to encounter the supernatural. I figured it would be peaceful, a quiet place to drink, relax, and forget about the world. We arrived at sunset, the cabin surrounded by trees, the last rays of the sun casting long shadows across the porch. The inside was rustic wooden floors, old furniture. The smell of pine lingered in the air. It felt cozy enough, and we spent the evening unpacking and talking. As night fell, a chill settled in. We gathered around the fire inside, laughing and joking about ghost stories, trying to keep the mood light. But then the wind picked up, rattling the windows. I dismissed it as a typical storm, but my friend Jack seemed unnerved. He kept glancing nervously at the door. "I think something's out there," he muttered, but we all laughed it off. We turned in for the night around midnight. My room was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway. The air was unusually cold, but I chalked it up to the old cabin. As I lay in bed, I heard the soft scrape of something dragging across the floor. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, like nails scraping wood. My heart raced. I told myself it was the wind or an animal outside. But then came the sound I couldn't ignore, a tap. Light but distinct, on my door. My blood ran cold. "Hello." I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. The wind outside had died down, and all that was left was the eerie silence. I decided to check the hallway. Slowly, I opened my door and crept into the dark corridor. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but the house was otherwise still. I reached the top of the stairs and hesitated. The downstairs was quiet, but there was a faint light coming from the living room. Someone was downstairs. I didn't want to go down, but I had to. Something felt wrong. I tiptoed down the stairs, every step echoing in the empty cabin. As I rounded the corner into the living room, I froze. The fire had gone out, but the room was lit by someone standing near the window. It was a figure, pale and unmoving, staring out into the night. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Then, without warning, it turned to face me. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow, a mass of blackness that seemed to absorb the light. No face, just a vague outline. It didn't move, didn't speak, it just stood there, watching me. My heart thudded in my chest. I stepped back, my foot catching the edge of the coffee table. The figure didn't flinch, didn't react, but the air grew colder, the silence heavier. I bolted upstairs and slammed my door shut. The entire night, I lay wide awake, heart racing, listening for any sound, but nothing came. No more knocks, no more scraping, just the sound of my own pulse in my ears. The next morning, I didn't want to mention it to my friends. I figured they'd think I was imagining things. But when we all gathered in the kitchen, I saw that Jack looked as pale as I felt. "I heard something last night," he said, voice trembling. "Someone was knocking at my window, and ... I saw something out there, a figure." My stomach twisted. Everyone shared their experiences, and it was clear none of us had slept well. I suggested we leave early, but no one wanted to drive back through the dark woods just yet. So, we decided to stay for one more night. That evening, we stayed inside. None of us wanted to go outside or even near the windows. We ate dinner in silence, the tension thick in the air. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for us. Around midnight, we heard the knocking. It started faint, then grew louder, almost as if it was coming from inside the walls. Everyone froze. The sound was relentless, rhythmic, like it was searching for a way in. Then, there was a voice, low and hoarse. "Let me in." It was unmistakable. We bolted out of the cabin and into the car, not even bothering to pack our things. As we drove away, I glanced back through the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, dark and silent except for the faint, flickering light from the upstairs window. Months later, I looked up the cabin online. The description said it was recently renovated, but the listing had been taken down. I found a local news article from the 1980s about a family that had gone missing near the cabin. They had been staying in a cabin just like ours, but the article never explained what happened to them. It didn't say they were found. I don't know what was in that cabin with us, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the sound of the knocking on the walls, and the voice that wasn't human. Something was in there, and it had been waiting for us to arrive. It was the middle of fall, and the forest looked beautiful, dense trees with leaves that were just starting to turn orange and gold. The air crisp but not too cold. A perfect day for a hike. The trail was familiar, but we wanted something more. We were looking for an old, forgotten part of the forest, rumored to have an abandoned cabin, a place where no one else dared to go. It didn't take long for the sun to dip lower in the sky, casting shadows across the path. We'd already been walking for hours. The only sounds were the crunching of leaves beneath our boots and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. There was an odd stillness about the forest, though, like the trees themselves were waiting for something. I didn't know why I noticed it at first, but the further we went, the more unsettled I became. At one point, we took a break near a stream. The others were chatting, but I couldn't focus on their words. I kept looking around, feeling like something was wrong. It wasn't the usual peaceful isolation of the forest, it was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't fit, something scraping against tree bark. I turned quickly, my eyes darting through the trees. There was nothing there. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice almost a whisper. One of my friends nodded, but the others just laughed it off. Probably a raccoon or something, they said, clearly not concerned. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. We continued on, the forest growing denser with every step. The path was growing harder to see, and it was getting darker faster than I had anticipated. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the wind had started to pick up, making everything feel colder than before. It was then that I heard it again, louder this time, a rustling, followed by that same scratching sound, like something or someone dragging something heavy along the ground. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding. Did anyone else hear that? I asked, my voice now tight with tension. They all looked around, then shrugged. It's just an animal, one of them said, but it wasn't just an animal. There was something different about it, the way it seemed to follow us, the odd rhythm of the scratching, like something was walking alongside us, but just out of sight. It felt deliberate, like we weren't alone. Finally, we came upon a clearing, and there it was, a small, dilapidated cabin, barely standing but unmistakable. We hesitated, the silence around us unnerving. This wasn't the kind of place you just stumble across. It felt wrong, like we had trespassed into a place we weren't meant to be. We decided to explore, carefully pushing the door open. The hinges creaked loudly as the door swung inward, revealing the dark interior. The smell of decay and mildew hit us immediately. The dust on the floor was untouched, and the air was thick with something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We were just about to leave when something caught my eye, a small, withered book sitting on a dusty wooden shelf. I picked it up, the cover fragile under my fingers. It had no title, just an odd symbol burned into the front. My curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. That's when I heard the scratching again, but this time it was louder, closer. The hair on my arm stood on end. I froze, eyes darting around the room. There was no mistaking it now, the scratching was coming from inside the cabin. Everyone was still. They heard it too. Then, the floorboards creaked behind me, and a chill ran down my spine. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight into the corner. A figure stood there, half hidden in the shadows. It wasn't human. Tall, unnaturally thin, its long fingers scraping the walls like claws. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and predatory. My breath caught in my throat. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The others were frozen too, eyes wide with terror. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, disappearing into the darkness beyond the cabin. We didn't hesitate after that. We sprinted out of the cabin, not daring to look back. But the forest was different now, quieter, darker. As we made our way back down the trail, I glanced down at the book in my hand. The symbol was now glowing faintly, its lines moving, shifting. I dropped it immediately, watching as it vanished into the leaves. When we finally made it back to the car, we didn't talk much. No one really knew what had happened. The forest felt different, as if it had somehow shifted, changed. And when we looked at the photos we took that day, one picture stood out, a blurry figure in the background, barely visible, standing motionless in the clearing. But in the photo, its eyes were glowing bright, watching us. That's when we realized the truth: the forest wasn't just holding its breath. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway. My friends and I, Rachel, Tom, and Jake, had been planning our camping trip for weeks. We chose a remote site deep in the woods, far away from city lights and noise, promising ourselves a weekend of relaxation and adventure. The air was crisp when we arrived, the sun shining bright overhead as we set up our tents by a small, glimmering lake. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. The flickering flames cast eerie shadows on the trees, creating an atmosphere that was both cozy and a little unnerving. After a while, Rachel suggested we play a game of truth or dare, which seemed harmless enough. We laughed, teased each other, and drank a few beers while the fire crackled. As the night wore on, a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the forest and muffling the sounds of the night. The laughter died down, and a strange quiet settled over us, broken only by the occasional snap of twigs in the distance. That's when I noticed the feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was lurking just beyond the reach of our firelight. Hey, did anyone else feel that? I asked, trying to lighten the mood. Jake laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Feel what? He said. The thrill of camping. Come on, we're fine. We decided to head to our tents for the night. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl. Suddenly, I heard something else, a faint whispering that seemed to float through the air. I sat up, straining to listen. The voices were indistinct, but they felt close, too close. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Rachel, I whispered, not wanting to alarm her. Do you hear that? She groaned and pulled the sleeping bag over her head. Hear what? Just go to sleep. But I couldn't. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt compelled to get out of my tent. I unzipped it quietly and stepped out, the cool air hitting my skin. The fog was thick, swirling around me, and the fire had died down to embers, casting dim, flickering shadows. I turned toward the woods where the whispers seemed to come from. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying gently. I felt drawn to them, as if the whispers were calling my name. Just as I took a step forward, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned to find Jake standing there, looking equally bewildered. Did you hear it too? He asked, his eyes wide with fear. Yeah, I replied, glancing back toward the trees. It's coming from over there. We stood there for a moment, caught between curiosity and dread. When Tom and Rachel emerged from their tents, groggy and confused. What's going on? Tom asked, rubbing his eyes. We heard voices, I explained, and as I did, the whispers intensified, almost as if they were responding to us. The four of us stood together, the fear palpable in the air. Suddenly, as if on cue, the whispers faded, and a silence fell over the woods. We looked at each other, our breaths visible in the chilly night air. Let's get back to the fire, Rachel said, her voice shaky. We hurried back, relieved to be in the warmth of the remaining embers. As we sat together, the tension slowly eased, though we couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us that night. Eventually, exhaustion overtook us, and we all crawled back into our tents, vowing to leave early in the morning. When dawn broke, we packed up quickly, eager to escape the strange occurrences of the night before. We drove home with a sense of relief, but deep down, I knew the forest held secrets I would never understand. To this day, I wonder what those whispers meant and if they were meant for us at all. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, a chance to escape the noise of the city and unwind in nature with my friends. We picked a remote spot deep in the woods, far from any trails or cabins. Just the four of us, me, Alex, Jenna, and Marcus. We set up our tents and gathered firewood, the atmosphere filled with laughter as the sun dipped below the horizon. As darkness enveloped the camp, we roasted marshmallows and shared stories that ranged from silly to spine-chilling. I felt a warm glow inside as I watched my friends enjoy the night, but it didn't last long. Alex suggested we play a game of truth or dare. I remember feeling a little uneasy about it. Something about the looming trees seemed to echo our laughter, almost mocking it. When it was my turn, I chose truth. I was asked about my biggest fear. I shared that I was terrified of being lost in the woods, alone and unable to find my way back. They laughed it off, but as I looked into the darkened tree line, I felt that familiar chill creep up my spine. After the game, Jenna suggested a night hike. I hesitated but agreed, thinking it would be a fun adventure. We grabbed our flashlights and headed down a narrow path surrounded by thick trees. The moonlight struggled to penetrate the canopy above, casting eerie shadows that danced along the ground. At first, we walked in jovial spirits, joking and laughing. But, as we moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere shifted. The wind picked up, causing the branches to sway and creak ominously. The sound of rustling leaves became unnaturally loud. I started to feel anxious, and I glanced around, noticing the darkness felt thicker here. Suddenly, we heard a noise, a distant, strange sound like metal scraping against metal. My heart raced. "Did you hear that?" I asked, trying to mask my fear. The others nodded, their faces pale. We decided to follow the sound, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear. As we crept forward, the noise grew louder. It wasn't just one sound, but a symphony of clanging and thudding, echoing through the trees. The lights from our flashlights flickered, and the shadows around us seemed to swirl ominously. I felt an urge to turn back, but the others pushed forward. Finally, we reached a clearing, and the scene before us froze me in place. Several figures were silhouetted against a flickering light, standing in a circle. They wore tattered clothing and strange masks made of bark and leaves. Each held a lantern, illuminating their expressions, which were a mix of excitement and something darker. My stomach churned as I realized they were not just hikers, but a strange, almost cult-like gathering. Before we could process what we were witnessing, one of the figures spotted us. A loud, eerie laughter erupted from the group, sending chills down my spine. Panic set in, and we turned to run, but the path behind us felt altered, the trees closing in as if they were shifting, trapping us. We stumbled through the underbrush, desperately trying to find our way back to camp. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the laughter that chased us. Just when I thought we were lost forever, we burst through the trees and back into our campsite, breathing heavily, but the camp wasn't how we left it. The fire pit was extinguished, the tents were torn, and our backpacks were scattered. In the center of the campsite was a single lantern, lit and flickering. Scrawled in the dirt around it were the words, "We've been waiting." Fear washed over us as we scrambled to gather our things. I glanced back toward the tree line, half expecting to see the figures watching us. We didn't speak as we packed, but the silence was thick with dread. We drove off in a rush, the night closing in around us. As we hit the road, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but the empty road behind us. Instead, I saw one of those figures standing at the edge of the woods, holding its lantern high, its face obscured by a mask. The last thing I remember is the figure raising a hand and pointing at me. And then we were gone. To this day, I avoid the woods, and I can never shake the feeling that they are waiting for me to return. As a park ranger, I've learned to appreciate the serenity of the woods, but that serenity can quickly turn into dread. It was the first week of October when I received a call about a family camping deep in the woods. They'd set up their tent near a secluded lake, and the father reported strange sounds echoing through the trees, unnatural and unsettling. I assured him I would investigate and packed my gear, feeling a growing unease. It was late afternoon when I set out, the sun dipping lower and casting elongated shadows. The path twisted through dense foliage, each step echoing in the silence. The vibrant hues of autumn leaves were almost too beautiful to warrant concern. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I approached the campsite, the air thickened with tension. I spotted their tent nestled among the trees, but noticed something strange. The campsite was eerily quiet. I called out, but only the wind responded. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on, pushing aside the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The first thing I noticed was a half-empty cooler, and my heart sank. It was as if they had just left, but something felt wrong. I stepped inside the tent, half expecting to see the family gathered around, but it was empty. Their sleeping bags were laid out, but personal items were strewn around as if they had been in a hurry. A flicker of movement caught my eye from outside. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I heard a low, rhythmic thumping noise coming from the edge of the forest. I followed the sound, my pulse racing. The trees thickened, their branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. As I approached, the thumping grew louder and seemed to pulse in sync with my heartbeat. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath as I tightened my grip. The beam of light revealed a tall figure standing at the edge of the trees. It was covered in dark, matted hair, and its limbs appeared unnaturally long. I was paralyzed for a moment, and then it turned its head toward me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Before I could react, it vanished behind the trees, leaving only the echo of its thumping sound. Fear coursed through me, and I bolted back toward the campsite. I had to find the family and get them out of here. As I ran, the woods seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my clothes, as if trying to hold me back. When I reached the campsite, I quickly grabbed my radio to call for backup, but it crackled with static. The fear clawing at my throat deepened. Just then, I heard a scream, piercing and desperate, coming from the direction of the lake. I sprinted toward the sound, praying I wasn't too late. I emerged onto the lake shore, and there they were, the family huddled together, staring wide-eyed at something in the water. I followed their gaze, and my stomach dropped. The figure I had seen earlier was now standing knee-deep in the lake, water dripping from its elongated limbs, its face obscured by shadows. In an instant, it turned its head toward us, and I felt a jolt of terror as it took a step forward, moving as fluidly as a shadow. Just then, the family scrambled back, and I shouted at them to run. I grabbed the father's arm, urging him to get his family moving. We ran back through the trees, the fear propelling us forward. I led them to a clearing where we could see the distant glow of the park's visitor center. It felt safe, and the sound of the creature faded behind us. We reached the building, breathless and terrified, but when I turned to check on them, my heart sank. The family was gone, no footprints in the mud, no sign of their presence. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had been talking to a family just moments before. I called out for them, panic flooding my senses. Then, I turned around, and there it was again, the creature. This time, it was standing right behind me, a chilling grin stretching across its face. I was frozen in place, but before I could scream, it whispered in a voice that chilled me to the bone. "You shouldn't have come here." And then it vanished into the shadows, leaving me alone, surrounded by the dense woods, knowing that whatever had taken the family would not stop until it claimed me too. The evening sun was sinking below the horizon as I patrolled the forest trails, the fading light casting long shadows between the trees. As a park ranger, I had learned to love the isolation and beauty of the deep woods, but tonight felt different. The chill in the air hinted at an approaching storm, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was off. Around dusk, I received a call on the radio about a family camping a few miles from my current position. They reported strange noises surrounding their tent. The mother sounded terrified, insisting it was something big prowling just beyond their campsite. I assured her I would head over immediately. After a quick check of my gear, I set off down the narrow trail. The deeper I walked into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees loomed overhead, blocking out what little light remained. My flashlight illuminated only a few feet ahead, and the darkness seemed to swallow the beams whole. As I trekked onward, the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional rustle in the underbrush. I kept my radio on, hoping to stay in touch with the family as I approached. When I reached their campsite, the first thing I noticed was the stillness. The family's tent was pitched in a small clearing, but there were no signs of life. My heart raced as I called out to them. Silence enveloped me, thick and heavy. I stepped closer and peered inside the tent, but it was empty. The sleeping bags lay undisturbed, and the gear was neatly packed. Something twisted in my gut as I wondered where they could be. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the trees nearby. I jumped, spinning around with my flashlight aimed into the darkness. The beam caught a glimpse of movement, a dark shape darting between the trees. Adrenaline surged through me. I yelled for the family, hoping they would respond, but only the wind answered. I decided to check the surrounding area. I took a few steps into the trees when I heard it, a low growl, rumbling and guttural. It sent chills down my spine. I felt like prey in a predator's territory. I called again, my voice trembling, but there was still no response. I was alone. The growling grew louder, closer. I turned to run back to the clearing, but I stumbled over a root and fell hard to the ground. My flashlight flew from my hand, clattering away into the darkness. I scrambled to my feet and frantically searched for the light. As I reached for it, I felt something brush against my arm. Panic gripped me, and I recoiled, heart racing. The flashlight flickered back to life in my hand, and as I turned, I saw it. A massive creature stood just a few feet away, its eyes reflecting the light like to glowing coals. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long. A deep growl emanated from its throat, vibrating in the air around me. My instincts screamed at me to flee, but I was frozen in place. Then, without warning, the creature lunged toward me. I ducked just in time, narrowly avoiding its grasp. I sprinted back to the tent, desperately calling for the family as I ran. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind me. My lungs burned, but I pushed forward, desperate to reach safety. I burst into the clearing, and to my shock, I found the family emerging from the trees, their faces pale and wide-eyed. They looked like they had been running too. I quickly waved them over and led them back to their tent. We huddled together, and I explained what I had seen. Just then, we heard the growl again, closer this time. We scrambled into the tent, my heart pounding as I pulled the flap shut. The creature's claws scraped against the tent fabric, and I felt its weight pressing against the structure. It felt like it was toying with us, waiting for us to show ourselves. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the creature stopped. Silence enveloped us. We waited, holding our breath, unsure of what to expect. After a long moment, the family's youngest child whispered, "Where did it go?" I took a deep breath and slowly opened the tent flap. Peering out, the clearing was empty. The creature had vanished. As we stumbled out into the moonlight, I noticed something strange on the ground, a footprint, but not a normal one. It was human-sized and oddly shaped, as if someone had been standing there all along. I turned to the family, and their faces mirrored my shock. What had chased us? Where had it gone? We looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between us. The true horror of the night was not the creature itself, but the fact that it could take on the form of a human. It could be anyone, lurking in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting group to stumble upon its domain. It started as a typical weekend trip. A group of us decided to camp in a remote forest, far from the noise and bustle of the city. We'd hiked a few miles into the woods, set up camp by a small stream, and settled in for a quiet night. The sun dipped below the trees, casting long, eerie shadows. The air was cool, and the forest was peaceful to peaceful. There was an unsettling silence that we couldn't shake off, but we joked around, tried to ignore it, and got a fire going. The first few hours were fine. We ate, told stories, and laughed, but as the night deepened, the atmosphere shifted. The once distant sounds of the forest seemed to grow closer. The rustling in the trees felt heavier, like something was moving just out of sight. We laughed nervously, but I could tell that none of us were feeling quite as relaxed as we had earlier. At some point, we all retreated to our tents. I was in a small tent alone, nestled into my sleeping bag, trying to sleep. The wind outside picked up, and the trees began to sway. Then, I heard something, a faint scratching noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate. It was rhythmic, like something or someone was dragging their fingers along the side of my tent. I tensed, my breath catching in my throat. The noise stopped, and I convinced myself it was nothing. But then I heard it again, louder this time. The sound wasn't just against my tent, it was moving, traveling, circling me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Then there was a sharp tug on the tent flap. I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or some other creature. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't feel like that. There was something too intentional about the way the tent moved. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to stick my head out. The beam swept across the campsite, across the clearing where our fire had burned out hours ago. The light caught nothing. Only trees, dark and still, with no sign of movement. I let out a shaky breath, but the scratching sound started again, closer now, as though it was right outside my tent. I mustered all my courage, unzipped the flap fully, and peeked out into the woods. There was nothing. But then I felt a cold gust of air against my neck, and I spun around. There, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, almost towering, with limbs that seemed to long for its body. I couldn't make out details in the darkness, but I could feel its presence. I blinked, and in that moment, it was gone. Just gone. I couldn't believe what I had seen. So I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, or perhaps my mind playing tricks. I quickly zipped up my tent and tried to calm myself. I wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe I had imagined it. Minutes later, though, the noise started again. The scratching. This time, it wasn't just against the tent. It was coming from every direction, as if the whole forest was closing in on me. I lay there, paralyzed, staring into the blackness outside, hoping the morning would come soon. The hours felt like days. Then, suddenly, I heard something even worse. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if something was pacing around my tent. I held my breath, my hands gripping my flashlight so hard my knuckles turned white. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I wanted to scream, but my throat was tight with fear. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, and then the voice came. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. Don single quotes T. Look ... The words sent a chill down my spine. My body shook uncontrollably, but I couldn't move. I had no idea what to do. And then, suddenly, everything stopped. The footsteps, the scratching, the voice. The air grew still again, too still. I waited, but there was nothing, just the silence of the woods. Finally, I gathered the strength to unzip the tent and peek outside again, shining the flashlight across the clearing. The figure was gone. There was nothing there at all. I didn't sleep a wink that night. When morning finally came, I rushed to wake my friends. I told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They thought I had imagined it. Maybe a bad dream or paranoia from the isolation. We packed up and left as soon as we could, but I knew what I had seen. I knew that something had been out there with me. I haven't camped in the woods since. But that night, there was one thing that stayed with me. The whisper I heard before everything went silent again. It wasn't a warning. It was a promise. It was late in the evening when I got a call over the radio about an abandoned camp. The site was deep in the backwoods, a place we don't usually check unless there's a report of trouble. I wasn't due for another round of patrol, but the dispatcher insisted. So I grabbed my flashlight and drove out to investigate. The sky was overcast, and the air had a strange stillness to it as I hiked toward the site. The path grew narrower and less familiar, a sign that I was venturing farther than usual. The forest here felt older, the trees thicker, and the usual sounds of rustling leaves and bird song seemed muted, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. When I reached the camp, everything seemed off. The fire pit was cold, the tent was half collapsed, and gear was strewn around like someone had hurriedly packed up. I frowned, wondering why someone would leave in such a rush. My job was to make sure everyone was safe. So I called out to see if anyone was nearby. No answer. I walked around the campsite, checking for signs of anyone nearby. But there was nothing, no footprints, no sign of struggle. Just a profound, unnerving quiet. Then, as I was about to head back, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Near the edge of the campsite, there was a large tree with strange markings on it, jagged lines carved into the bark as though something had scratched it with force. Curious and uneasy, I approached. The marks were deep, unnaturally so, and they appeared to form patterns strange, almost symbol-like patterns I couldn't quite make sense of. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I studied them, and a sudden coldness swept over me. That's when I heard it, a low, distant hum. It wasn't a sound I'd ever heard in the forest before. The air seemed to vibrate with it. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It felt like it was coming from the ground itself. My flashlight flickered, then went out completely. I cursed under my breath, smacking the flashlight against my hand to get it working again. As I fiddled with it, trying to get the beam back, the humming grew louder, more intense. My heart raced. I had to leave, but something kept me rooted to the spot. A feeling, a sense of being watched. Then, the humming stopped abruptly. I froze, holding my breath. That's when I heard the footsteps. Not normal footsteps, too slow. deliberate, crunching leaves and twigs, moving in my direction. My pulse thundered in my ears. I slowly turned, eyes darting into the darkened trees, searching for the source. I couldn't see anything, but I felt something. The air was thicker now, heavier. I took a step back, my instincts screaming that I was not alone. Then, as if from nowhere, a loud, jarring crash sounded behind me. I spun around, flashlight finally flicking back to life. The beam caught a figure standing at the tree line, just at the edge of the clearing. My blood ran cold. It was a person or something resembling one. Tall, thin, unnaturally so. And its body was covered in dirt and leaves, like it had been hiding in the forest for who knows how long. Its face was pale, almost sickly, and its eyes, I'll never forget its eyes. Black, empty, like voids, no soul behind them. The thing stood still, watching me, as the air hummed again, just beneath the surface. I took a step backward, my hand shaking as I reached for my radio. My voice trembled when I called in, trying to keep calm. I didn't want to take my eyes off the figure. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. I stood there for what felt like forever, heart hammering in my chest. When I finally gathered the courage to move, I couldn't get out of that campsite fast enough. I radioed back to headquarters, telling them what happened, but they couldn't find any record of any hikers or campers in the area that night. Nothing. I reported the strange carvings on the tree, but no one seemed to take it seriously. The next day, I went back to check, hoping I had imagined it. But when I arrived, the markings on the tree were gone, completely vanished. It's been months since that night, and I still can't shake the feeling that something is out there in the woods, something that's been waiting for the right moment to show itself. But the worst part, I didn't realize it until weeks later, when I was reviewing the radio transmission from that night. Right at the moment I called for backup, there was a strange, static-filled voice in the background of the recording. It said only one thing: "Don't leave." It began on a cold, damp evening when my cousin invited me to help clean out the attic of his late grandfather's house. The old house had been empty for months, sitting untouched on a lonely hill surrounded by dense woods. He had asked me to come along because the place gave him the creeps, and honestly, I couldn't blame him. The house was ancient, its wooden frame groaning in protest every time the wind shifted. The attic was the worst. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew clung to everything. It was crammed with boxes, furniture draped in yellowed sheets, and old mirrors leaning precariously against the walls. A single, naked bulb hung from the ceiling, casting long, jagged shadows. It was the kind of place that made your skin crawl for no good reason. As we worked through the clutter, sorting what to keep and what to toss, I couldn't help but feel like the shadows were moving. Every time I glanced at the mirrors, I thought I caught something out of place. Not me, not my cousin, but something else. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of too much caffeine and too little sleep. But the feeling wouldn't go away. We worked until the sun set, and darkness filled the attic. The bulb cast a sickly yellow light, barely illuminating the room. My cousin, sorting through an old trunk, suddenly froze and held something up. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and brittle. He opened it, and the brittle pages crumbled slightly at the edges. It was filled with spidery handwriting, most of it illegible except for one phrase, which repeated over and over: "Don't let it in." My cousin laughed nervously, brushing it off as a weird quirk of an old man with too much time on his hands. But the air felt heavier after that, as if the room itself were holding its breath. We tried to shake it off and keep working, but the unease only grew. I felt like we were being watched. Every so often, I'd turn to look at the mirrors, and I could have sworn there was something wrong with our reflections. The movements weren't quite right, like a half-second delay. I said nothing, afraid of sounding paranoid. But then my cousin spoke up, his voice trembling. He asked if I'd noticed something strange. Before I could answer, the light bulb flickered and went out, plunging the attic into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the sound of my breathing loud in the silence. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating the rows of mirrors. That's when I saw it. In one of the mirrors near the back of the attic, there was a third reflection. It wasn't me, and it wasn't my cousin. It was taller, hunched, with impossibly long arms and a face that looked almost human but not quite right. Its eyes were black pits, its mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too far. My cousin gasped. He saw it too. I swung the flashlight around, but there was nothing there. Only the cluttered attic and the oppressive darkness. My hands shook as I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, but now it was closer. It was staring directly at me, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I grabbed my cousin's arm. My voice barely a whisper. We needed to leave, now. He nodded, and we stumbled down the narrow stairs, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. As we reached the hallway, we heard it, a scraping sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from the attic. We didn't stop to investigate, we ran. The house seemed to twist and stretch around us, the walls closing in as we stumbled toward the front door. The scraping sound grew louder, faster, chasing us. Just as we reached the door, I turned back, unable to help myself. At the top of the stairs, it stood, the same figure from the mirror, hunched and grinning, its eyes fixed on us. But what made my blood run cold was the realization that it wasn't just standing there, it was holding the journal. The phrase "Don't let it in" was scrawled across its body, etched into its skin like deep, angry scars. We burst out into the night, slamming the door behind us. The sound of the scraping stopped. The house loomed behind us, silent and dark, its windows like empty eyes watching us leave. We didn't speak as we drove away, too shaken to process what had happened. To this day, I can't explain it. I don't know what we saw or how it was possible. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself avoiding mirrors, and every now and then, out of the corner of my eye, I think I see that twisted grin staring back at me. I never thought much about haunted houses or strange occurrences. I was always the one to brush off stories, but everything changed during a trip with some friends a few years ago. We decided to rent a secluded cabin for the weekend, far away from any city lights or distractions. It seemed like the perfect escape, peaceful, quiet, surrounded by trees. The first night was fine. We settled in, made dinner, and started telling ghost stories by the fire. I wasn't scared until we heard something strange. Around midnight, after we'd all gone to bed, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on my window. It was a rhythmic, slow tapping, like someone knocking. I told myself it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the glass. But then it happened again, a little louder this time. I felt a chill run down my spine. I got up to check, but when I looked out the window, there was nothing there, just darkness and the rustling of trees. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing it, tapping, soft and persistent. Then, a voice, a faint whisper. It said my name, Sarah. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing. I looked around the room, but it was empty, still. The whispering stopped as soon as I looked out the window, but I felt something watching me. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt thick, charged with something I couldn't understand. I stayed awake the rest of the night, unable to shake the feeling that something was out there, something waiting. When morning came, I didn't tell anyone. They'd all laugh at me, and I didn't want to sound crazy. But that evening, as we sat around the fire, one of my friends, Jake, casually mentioned hearing the same tapping the night before. Then, Emma spoke up. She'd heard the whispering too, only she thought it was just a dream. We all went silent. Maybe it's an animal, Mark said, trying to ease the tension. But we were all on edge now, aware of the strange sounds that had plagued us. Later that night, I decided to check the window again. Maybe I could convince myself it was just the wind or something. As I walked to the window, I felt a cold draft sweep across my skin. I pulled the curtain back, but the tapping was there again, like it was coming from just beyond the glass. I gasped, backing away, my mind racing. Then, I noticed something else. There was a shadow moving outside. It was too dark to make out details, but it wasn't the shape of a person, it was too fluid, like it was slithering, creeping around the cabin. I rushed to wake the others. We stood in the living room, staring out the windows, trying to make sense of what we were seeing. The shadow moved in circles around the cabin, and then, it stopped, right at the front door. There was no knock, just an intense silence that filled the space. We waited, holding our breath. And then, The door creaked open on its own, slowly, as if someone or something had entered. The door wasn't locked. It wasn't supposed to open like that. We rushed to the door, and as we stepped outside, we saw what had been circling the cabin. Footprints. Large, uneven prints, leading toward the woods. Something had been out there, watching us, moving around the cabin. But what terrified me most wasn't the footprints, it was the set of prints that led right back to the door. Whoever, or whatever it was, had been right inside with us, watching, waiting. We didn't stay the next night. We packed up quickly and left, too frightened to even consider staying any longer. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know one thing for sure: something was in that cabin with us. Something that moved without a sound, waited without a breath, and followed us back home. The question still lingers in my mind: is it still waiting? Cabin in the woods, just me and a few friends. No distractions, no work, just nature. We had rented the place online, a secluded spot far from civilization. None of us were particularly into ghost stories. So when we arrived and saw how isolated the cabin was, it felt more peaceful than eerie. The cabin itself was charming, if a bit old. The walls creaked in places, but we didn't think much of it. The first night, after a few drinks and some laughter, we headed to bed, but sleep didn't come easily for me. The room was unnervingly quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind howling outside, and then scratch a faint noise from the other side of the cabin. I chalked it up to the wind or maybe an animal outside, but when the scratching sound continued, it became harder to ignore. It wasn't just random noise, it was deliberate, like something or someone was trying to get inside. I waited for my friends to make a joke about it. When no one did, I decided to get up and check. I crept down the hallway toward the front door, peering through the window at the darkness outside. Nothing. No movement, just trees swaying under the moonlight. I sighed in relief and turned to head back to my room. That's when I heard a soft, desperate knock on the door. Knock. Knock. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I froze. Who would be knocking at this hour, especially in such a remote place? I moved slowly back toward the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I stood there, straining my ears for any sounds. There was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, just silence. I finally returned to my room, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I locked the door behind me, pulled the blanket over my head, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to my friends, hoping they would laugh it off. But no one did. Instead, Sarah, one of the girls with us, said she heard something too. She described the same scratching sound I'd heard, but from the window. She had thought it was an animal at first, but the knocking she couldn't explain. We spent the day hiking through the woods, trying to clear our heads. It felt like the cabin was miles away from any other human being. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was watching us. That night, after dinner, we were all sitting around the fireplace, and the conversation turned toward local legends. Apparently, the area was known for being haunted, or so the locals claimed. One of my friends, Jake, started telling a story about a woman who had gone missing years ago, her last known location being just a few miles from the cabin. He described how people said they could hear her crying at night. I laughed it off. Ghost stories didn't scare me. Later that night, when we were all in our rooms, I heard the sound again, the unmistakable scratch on the wood. And then, once again, the knock. But this time, it wasn't on the door. It was on my window. I rushed to the window and pulled the curtain back, heart racing. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I closed the curtains quickly, then heard it again. A whisper, faint but clear. Let me in. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My body was frozen in place. I glanced toward the door. Still locked. My room felt suffocating. The knock came again. Bang. Louder this time. It was coming from the front door. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran out of my room, down the hall to the living room, and yanked open the door. Nothing. No one was outside. Just the pitch-black darkness of the woods. My breath was coming in sharp gasps as I stood there, staring out into the void. I closed the door, leaning against it, trying to calm myself. And then, in the faint light of the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The doorknob was wet. A trail of dark smudges marked the wooden floor, leading from the door to the window of the living room. I followed the trail, every step feeling like it was pulling me into some kind of nightmare. I reached the window. There, smeared against the glass, was a handprint, and it wasn't small. It was large for a person. I backed away in terror, stumbling toward the door. But when I looked out into the woods again, I saw something. A figure, standing in the distance, just outside the boundary of the trees. It was watching us. It was always watching. I slammed the door shut and rushed to wake the others. But when I turned to tell them, they were all standing in the hallway, staring at me in silence. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. It wasn't until I looked down that I realized the handprint wasn't on the window. It was on the back of my hand, and it was still wet. We packed up and left at once, leaving the cabin behind. But every time I close my eyes, I still see that figure in the distance. And the worst part, I know it followed us. We never should have left. It started as a simple road trip. My friends and I had planned to drive through some scenic back roads, far from the city, to escape the monotony of daily life. There were 4 of us in total, packed into a single car, with snacks and playlists ready to fill the hours. The air was filled with laughter, the kind that comes easily when you're surrounded by people who know you best. As evening fell, we realized we had underestimated the distance between stops. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and we hadn't seen another car or building in hours. The GPS signal had dropped, leaving us navigating by instinct and the dim headlights. The road narrowed, lined by towering trees that seemed to close in on us the further we drove. When we finally spotted an old gas station, the relief in the car was palpable. The gas station looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The sign was rusted, and the single pump looked ancient. But the lights inside the small convenience store were on, casting a weak yellow glow into the darkness. One of my friends, let's call him Alex, volunteered to check it out while we stayed behind to stretch our legs. We watched Alex disappear through the door, the light swallowing him up. The air outside was cold, and an unsettling quiet settled over the area. No crickets, no wind, just an oppressive silence. I glanced at the trees, their shadows shifting unnaturally in the dim light of the car's headlights. Alex returned a few minutes later, looking uneasy. He said there was a man behind the counter who hadn't spoken a word, just stared at him while he paid for the gas. He'd filled up the tank already. So, we piled back into the car, eager to leave. As we drove away, I glanced back at the gas station. The man Alex mentioned was standing in the doorway, watching us. His face was pale, almost skeletal, and his eyes seemed to reflect the headlights like an animal's. I turned back around, heart pounding, but I didn't say anything. The road ahead became even narrower, and the trees seemed thicker, their branches hanging low as if trying to trap us. The mood in the car shifted from lighthearted to tense as we drove deeper into the forest. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving us in complete darkness. We sat in silence for a moment, the realization sinking in that we were stranded. Alex tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't turn over. The only sound was the soft creak of the cooling engine. We were debating whether to wait or start walking when we heard it a loud, deliberate knock on the car window. It came from my side. I whipped my head around, but there was nothing there. My friend in the back seat swore she saw something moving just outside her window. But when we all looked, the forest was still. We locked the doors, our breath shallow, hearts racing. Then came the knock again, this time on the rear window. Louder, more forceful. Something scraped along the side of the car, a long, drawn-out sound like nails on metal. We sat frozen, staring into the darkness, when the knocking started again. It moved from window to window, rhythmic and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever it was circling us. Suddenly, the car's interior lights flickered on, bathing us in harsh yellow light. That's when we saw it, a face pressed against the driver's side window, pale and hollow-eyed, its mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. Before any of us could scream, the lights flickered again and went out, leaving us in darkness once more. The knocking stopped. We sat in silence, too scared to move or speak, when the car engine roared to life on its own. The headlights blazed back on, illuminating the road ahead. Without hesitation, Alex slammed on the gas, and we sped down the narrow road. None of us dared to look back. We didn't stop until we reached a town several miles away. When we pulled into a well-lit gas station, the relief was overwhelming. We climbed out of the car, still shaken, and that's when we saw it. Long scratches ran down the length of the car, deep grooves carved into the metal. At the back of the car, smeared in what looked like ash, were handprints. Too large to be human. We never figured out what happened that night. We didn't report it. Who would believe us? But every time I drive through a wooded area, I catch myself glancing into the trees, expecting to see that pale face watching, waiting. And sometimes, just for a split second, I swear I do. It started as an innocent idea. My friends and I were looking for something to do one evening, and when Mark suggested we explore the abandoned amusement park just outside of town, it seemed like the perfect adventure. We were young, reckless, and eager for a thrill, unaware that the park had a reputation. The sun was just beginning to set as we approached the rusted gates, which hung crooked and creaked in the wind. The faded, peeling sign read Wonderland of Wonders in letters that had almost been swallowed by time. We stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of metal and the faint, sharp tang of rust. The place was silent except for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant screech of a crow. We walked past the ticket booth, its glass pane shattered and dark, and made our way to the old Ferris wheel. It loomed above us, a skeletal giant. The paint was chipped and flaking, and the seats were bent and warped, some hanging at odd angles. We dared each other to climb up into the rusted cars and take photos. I pulled out my phone and snapped a picture as Sam posed dramatically, making a face. That's when we heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like a stick tapping on metal. At first, I thought it was just a rodent, but then it came again, closer this time. I glanced at Mark, who was staring at the carousel. The horses were frozen mid-gallop, their eyes wide and hollow, as if they had seen something that terrified them. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely above a breath. We all exchanged uneasy glances, the jovial air now replaced with tension. We started walking toward the carousel when the tapping sound came again, this time from behind us. I turned quickly, heart racing, but the place was empty. Just the broken down rides, the scattered debris, and the wind that seemed to have picked up speed. "Maybe we should leave," I suggested, glancing nervously at the way we had come. "No, let's check out the fun house," Sam said, his voice cracking. He tried to sound brave, but it came out hollow. We hesitated, but curiosity won out, and we made our way toward the warped fun house at the center of the park. The entrance was a gaping mouth, the teeth jagged and chipped. The darkness inside seemed to beckon us. We stepped inside, and the air grew colder, the smell of damp and decay stronger. The floor creaked as we moved through, and suddenly the sound started up again, tapping, like fingernails on glass. I shivered, but before I could say anything, Sam screamed. We rushed to him, finding him backed up against a mirror, staring at his reflection. But it wasn't just his reflection. It was a face, pale and wide-eyed, staring back at him with a grin that stretched impossibly wide. It moved, just slightly, tilting its head like it was studying him. He stumbled away, pushing past us, and we bolted out of the funhouse, gasping for breath. Outside, the wind had stopped, and the silence was deafening. We didn't speak, just ran back to the entrance, but as I glanced behind me, I saw hundreds of reflections in the shattered mirrors of the funhouse, all faces that were watching us, grinning, unmoving. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of the main road, gasping and shaking, looking back to see the amusement park shrouded in darkness. The only light was the faint glow of the moon, casting long, eerie shadows across the broken rides. To this day, we never speak of what happened there. But sometimes, late at night, I hear a soft tapping sound, like nails on glass, and I know that somewhere, in the dark, a reflection is waiting for me to look. We started our hike early, the sun just beginning to climb above the horizon, painting everything in soft hues of pink and gold. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with the kind of crisp air that filled your lungs and made you feel alive. The hike itself wasn't too difficult, and we made good time. The cliffs loomed ahead, their jagged edges sharp against the sky. By noon, we reached the highest point. We stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. Below, the ocean stretched out endlessly, its deep blue surface dotted with white caps. The rocks beneath our feet were slippery, but we were careful. There was no real danger, just awe at how wild and beautiful the world could be. We ate lunch on the cliffs, chatting about everything and nothing, when the first odd thing happened. At the far end of the cliff, just out of sight from where we were sitting, there was a figure. It wasn't someone from our group. This person was standing motionless, facing the ocean, a dark silhouette against the light. I squinted, trying to make out details, but they were too far away. I mentioned it to the others, but they just laughed it off. Probably someone else out here, Mark said. Lots of people hike this spot, but it felt strange. The figure didn't move, not even to adjust their posture, just standing still, unmoving. I turned away, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It wasn't until we finished eating and packed up to leave that the figure became more troubling. We hadn't seen them leave, and the spot they were standing in was still empty. But the odd thing was, we now found fresh footprints in the dirt, footprints that led directly to the cliff's edge. I could tell they were recent, still deep and dark in the dirt, like someone had been standing right there only moments before. We followed the trail, but it led nowhere. The cliffs dropped sharply into the ocean below, with nothing but jagged rocks and a vast emptiness stretching out. There was no way the person could have just walked off the edge. It didn't make sense. I didn't say anything at the time, but the unease was growing in me. There was something wrong here. The longer I looked at the prints, the more unsettled I became. They didn't seem like the footprints of someone who had been hiking. They were too deliberate, too precise, like they had been placed there for a reason. I tried to push it out of my mind, but as we began heading back down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. My skin prickled with an invisible tension. We continued, laughing and talking, but I kept looking over my shoulder. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, we began to make our way back toward the parking area. That's when I saw it again, the same figure. This time, they were not far from us, standing in the shadow of a large rock. Their back was to us, but I could see something clearly. They were holding something in their hands, something I couldn't identify, but it was too big and too unnatural to ignore. I stopped walking, and my friends turned to look at me. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, her brow furrowing. "There's someone over there," I said, pointing. But when I looked again, the figure was gone. The space was empty. "Stop messing with us," Mark said, rolling his eyes. "There's no one there," but I was sure. I'd seen it clearly. My heart began to race. I wanted to leave, to get back to the car and drive far away from this place, but something made me stop. I wanted to believe I was imagining it, but deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. We reached the parking area just as the sun was setting. It was a small, gravel lot with a single path leading to the main road. As we neared the cars, I heard a sound, a low, grating noise, like something scraping against stone. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing behind us except the dense trees and the empty, silent cliff. But then, I heard something else, a voice. It was faint, carried by the wind, but it was unmistakable. The voice was saying my name. I froze. It wasn't one of my friends. It was a voice I didn't recognize, soft but clear, as if it had been waiting for me to hear it. "Don't leave." I snapped around to face my friends, but they were already piling into the cars, unaware of the chill that had run down my spine. I didn't tell them what I'd heard. I didn't want to sound crazy. I just wanted to get out of there. We left the cliffs, the strange voice still echoing in my mind. The car ride back was quiet, everyone too exhausted to talk. But when I got home later, that night, I noticed something on my phone, a new notification, a picture. It was a photo of me, taken from behind, standing on the edge of the cliffs. But I was alone in the photo. The figure was nowhere to be seen. And then, I noticed something chilling in the background. There was someone else in the shadows, just out of view, watching me from a distance. The night started out like any other. I was out with my sister on a late-night walk along the riverbank, the kind that's more about talking and unwinding than anything else. It was fall, and the leaves were like fire on the trees, glowing under the dim moonlight. We had been talking about everything and nothing, our laughter echoing against the water. We walked a good distance from the street lights, far enough to be swallowed by the general darkness. The city was just a smudge in the distance, a heartbeat I could barely hear. The river murmured alongside us, its surface shimmering with the moon's pale gaze. I was just about to ask her what she wanted for her birthday when I heard it. A sound. It was faint, but distinct, a splashing noise. I paused, my gaze darting to the water. "Did you hear that?" I asked. She looked at me with wide eyes, then shook her head. I could feel the cool night air pressing against my skin, making me shiver. It was almost like the river was alive, a giant creature whispering something I couldn't understand. I didn't want to look away, but I did, turning my head back to her and forcing a smile. "Probably just a fish," I said, but my voice was more unsure than I'd intended. Then we heard it again, this time louder and closer. It was a splashing, but not just one. It was a series of splashes, rhythmic, deliberate. I spun around, heart racing. The surface of the water rippled, churning as if something unseen was moving underneath. Before I could speak, a figure shot out of the water, draped in wet, tangled hair and clothes that clung to its skeletal frame. Its eyes, God, its eyes were empty, black as the deepest night. It reached out, clawed fingers outstretched, and its mouth fell open in a silent scream. I grabbed my sister's arm, pulling her backward as the creature lunged. It hit the bank with a sickening thud and clawed itself toward us, dragging its body with an unnatural, jerky motion. We stumbled and ran, gasping for breath as we tore through the trees, their branches snagging at our clothes. My sister tripped and fell, and I turned around, my chest already burning from the effort. It was right there, only a few feet away. Its wet eyes locked onto mine, and I couldn't move, couldn't scream. But then, just as suddenly as it had emerged, it froze, its head tilting as if listening to something I couldn't hear. A whistle. Low and guttural, like something shifting in the dark. It was coming from the woods. The creature's mouth shut, and for a second, I thought it was about to retreat. Then it turned its head to the source of the sound, its movements quick and sharp. The dark woods behind us seemed to shiver as something else emerged. Another figure, its shape indistinguishable but bigger, moving with a rhythm that didn't belong to anything human. My sister pulled on my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to go now," she shouted, and I stumbled, barely catching myself before we ran, the sound of wet footsteps pounding after us. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of the nearest street light, our breath ragged, our legs shaking. The creature didn't follow. It stayed there, at the edge of the woods, staring, the inky darkness of its eyes glistening under the moon. I glanced back once more before we sprinted home, every step feeling like it could be our last. The next morning, I went back to the river, heart heavy and fists clenched. I found the spot where we'd seen it, hoping to make sense of what happened. The water was still, the surface unmod. There was no sign of anything abnormal, just the calm flow of the river, the rustle of leaves, and the whispering wind. But on the ground, near the edge, was a single, tiny footprint, wet and shaped like a child's, and the sound of a whistle, sharp and low, came from the woods behind me. I was never a fan of the old, abandoned amusement park on the edge of town. It was more of an eyesore than anything, a relic from a better time, rusted and decaying. But on that day, with the sun low and the air heavy with the smell of rain, my friends convinced me to go. We wanted something different for once, and what better way to kick off the summer than exploring somewhere creepy? We made our way through the overgrown paths and cracked pavement, the chirping of cicadas growing louder as the sky darkened. The entrance was flanked by two massive, stone lions with chipped noses and vacant eyes. We pushed open the wrought iron gate, the hinges protesting with a screech that echoed in the silence. The place was a maze of forgotten rides. The Ferris wheel loomed over us like a skeletal giant, its seat swaying in the breeze. A bumper car track sat to the left, rusted vehicles tilted at odd angles. We wandered further in, laughing and daring each other to go deeper. It was around the fun house when I noticed the first strange thing. A soft, metallic thud came from behind us, like someone had dropped a heavy tool. We all turned, but the path was empty, probably just a raccoon, Lisa said, brushing her hair behind her ear. But I felt it then, a presence, a tingle that ran from the back of my neck to my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. I glanced at my friends, but they were too busy poking fun at each other to notice. We pressed on, past a derelict clown stage where torn posters flapped like restless ghosts. The wind picked up, swirling around us and making the plastic banners snap like whips. Then, without warning, we heard a low, groaning hum that seemed to come from deep within the ground. "What was that?" Mark whispered, his voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, the ground beneath us shuddered. I stumbled, grabbing for the nearest rail. The whole park seemed to shift, as if a giant had taken a deep breath. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went still. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice more urgent than I intended. But they didn't hear me. Their eyes were wide, fixed on the Ferris wheel. I turned to see what they were looking at and my blood froze. The wheel had moved. Just a fraction, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. One of the seats, a rusty bucket on the edge, creaked forward and backward like it was testing the air. And then, a child's giggle rang out. It was high-pitched and sweet, but it wasn't human. My breath caught in my throat as I turned back to my friends. "We need to leave now," I said, grabbing Mark by the arm, but he didn't move. He was staring at the clown's stage where a small, shadowy figure stood. It had the shape of a child, but its limbs were too long and bent at unnatural angles. Another giggle, closer this time. I pulled Mark again, but he yanked his arm free and stumbled backward, eyes wide with terror. The figure on the stage came to life. It moved with the jerky, stuttering motion of a marionette, limbs twitching in a dance that felt both mechanical and alive. It was dressed in a faded clown suit, with patches that looked like they had been stitched with coarse, black thread. Its face was painted in a grotesque grin, eyes hollow and unblinking. "Get out," I screamed, grabbing Lisa and dragging her toward the exit. We ran past the bumper cars, the wind roaring behind us as the distant sound of a carnival organ started up, playing a broken, discordant tune. As we reached the gate, the childish giggle cut through the air again, louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder one last time and saw a pale hand, fingers too long and tipped with dark nails, reaching out from the edge of the Ferris wheel seat. The night air felt sharp as we bolted through the gate, the iron bars clanging shut behind us. We didn't stop running until we were far from the park, the sounds of the organ still ringing in our ears. None of us spoke on the way home. When we looked at each other, we knew we had seen a glimpse of something that shouldn't be. A reminder that some places hold more than just memories. They hold echoes of things that should have been forgotten. And the park, with its twisted laughter and stilled rides, was far from abandoned. It was waiting. I didn't expect the quiet to be so loud. The wind had stopped, and the moonlight cast long, distorted shadows across the deserted parking lot of the old amusement park. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, still and broken, like a giant skeleton. It had been years since anyone had come here, but I'd wanted to see it one last time. The place had been the highlight of my childhood, a backdrop for days spent laughing and riding the roller coasters until we were dizzy. I hadn't realized just how eerie it would feel to stand there alone, to be surrounded by the crumbling reminders of happier days. My shoes crunched over the gravel as I made my way toward the carousel. It was wrapped in rust and shadow. The painted horses froze in mid-gallop, their eyes cracked and hollow. I thought I heard something. A whisper, barely louder than the wind that was now just a memory. My heart picked up speed, but I told myself it was the sound of my own nerves. I wasn't alone, though. I knew it, deep down in my gut. I wasn't the only one there. I turned to leave, the uneasy sensation pressing at the back of my neck. But then I heard a laughter that rang out, bright and childlike, from the direction of the fun house. My breath caught in my throat. No one had been there when I arrived. I would have seen them. The fun house had been sealed shut, its doors warped and peeling like cold skin. The laughter came again, louder this time, and then a second sound joined it, a deep, grating laugh that didn't belong to any child. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself forward, past the ticket booths and past the warped remnants of the bumper cars. Each step was a battle, and when I reached the entrance to the fun house, I hesitated. The glass panels were cracked and warped, reflecting my pale, wide-eyed face back at me. The laughter stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. I knew I should run. I knew I should get out of there and never come back. But I was frozen, and then the door creaked open on its own, as if inviting me in. I stepped inside, and the air was damp and heavy, filled with the scent of mold and something sharp I couldn't place. The sound of my breath echoed in the empty halls, and the lights overhead flickered to life, casting jagged shadows that danced like living things. I took a shaky step forward, and then another. My fingers brushed against the peeling wallpaper, and I shuddered. There were mirrors everywhere, warped and cracked. They made me look like I was bending and breaking, and in some, I saw reflections of people I knew I hadn't brought with me. A girl with dark hair and wide, staring eyes. A man with hollow cheeks and a grin too wide to be human. I spun around, searching for the exit, but I couldn't remember how I'd gotten in. My pulse quickened as I heard the sound of footsteps, soft but deliberate, behind me. The sound echoed in the mirrored hallways, and I caught a glimpse of a shadow moving just out of reach. I whipped around, heart slamming against my ribcage, but there was nothing. Just my reflection, looking back with a smile that wasn't mine. The laughter came again, close this time, and I screamed. I ran, blindly, the world around me a whirl of broken glass and cracked laughter. I stumbled and fell, scraping my palms against the cold tile, and when I looked up, the hallway was no longer empty. Figures emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, with eyes that glistened like wet stones and smiles that stretched impossibly wide. The last thing I saw before I turned and bolted was my own reflection in the cracked mirror. It wasn't a mirror anymore. It was a face, pale and twisted, reaching out for me with fingers that passed through the glass and grabbed my arm. I never stopped running. I burst out of the fun house and into the cold, empty night, gasping for air. The laughter still echoed behind me, but when I dared to look back, the fun house was gone. Just an empty patch of ground, a dark hole in the earth. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I know this. When I left that night, I wasn't alone, and whatever it was, it followed me home. I never thought camping in the wilderness would be anything but peaceful. My friends and I had planned it for months, picking a remote spot deep in the woods far from the noise of civilization. We were seasoned campers, ready to embrace the quiet solitude of nature. Or so we thought. We arrived late in the afternoon and set up camp, a small fire crackling as dusk began to settle. The forest around us seemed alive, every rustling leaf and snapping twig hinting at something just out of sight. But we laughed it off, sitting around the fire, sharing stories, and roasting marshmallows. By the time the fire was dying down and the shadows grew long, the full moon cast an eerie glow on the trees. It was then that I first felt a faint unease, something creeping at the back of my mind, but I shrugged it away. We were safe. We were all together. As the night grew colder, I noticed how unusually quiet the forest had become. No crickets, no owls, no distant calls of animals. It was as if the entire world had frozen. I glanced around at my friends, each of them staring into the fire, their faces lit with an orange glow. Suddenly, a snap of a twig broke the silence. Sharp and sudden, we all froze. It was too distinct, too deliberate to be an animal. I stood up slowly, trying to peer into the darkness beyond our camp. Nothing, just trees, swaying lightly in the wind. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Trying to shake off the paranoia, I went to fetch more wood from the pile we had gathered earlier. As I turned my back to the fire, I heard a soft rustling sound behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. The fire crackled, and for a brief moment, the world was bathed in light, but there was no one there. My friends hadn't moved, still fixated on the fire. I frowned, convinced it was the wind or my imagination, but then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something moving in the woods. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was tall, thin, and hunched. My stomach dropped. I stepped back toward the camp, my eyes never leaving the shadow. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They all looked at me, confused. "See what?" One of them replied. I shook my head. Maybe it was just my nerves. "Nothing. Never mind." I stayed by the fire, but I couldn't stop watching the woods. The figure was still there, unmoving, but somehow, I knew it was staring right at me. I wanted to scream, but something told me if I did, I might invite whatever it was to approach, My instinct screamed for us to leave, but I couldn't move. After what felt like hours, the figure finally vanished, blending into the shadows as if it had never been there. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had seen, but deep down, I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. It was real. Whatever it was still out there. We spent the rest of the night in silence, the fire burning low, our eyes darting nervously around the camp. None of us wanted to speak of what had happened, but we all felt it. The heavy, suffocating presence of something watching us. When morning finally arrived, we were exhausted, but the woods were peaceful again. The birds were singing, and the sun filtered through the trees like it always had. We packed up quickly, eager to leave the woods behind. As we made our way back to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being followed. Every sound, every rustling branch, made me jump. When we reached the clearing where we'd parked, I turned for one last look at the forest. That's when I saw it again, just beyond the tree line. The same figure, standing motionless, watching us. But here's the twist: the figure wasn't alone. There were dozens of them, scattered throughout the woods, all standing perfectly still, all watching us. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. As one of them stepped forward. It was then that I realized something far more chilling. It wasn't human. Its limbs were too long, its posture too unnatural. I could feel my blood run cold as it tilted its head slightly, as if studying us. I turned to my friends, but they were already moving, running without a word, all of us scrambling to get to the car. We didn't look back until the engine roared to life, and we were speeding down the road. We made it back home, safe and sound. But to this day, I can't stop thinking about that night. The things we saw in the woods weren't just watching us, they were waiting for something. Waiting for us to make the wrong move, to stray too far, to stumble into their territory. We were lucky to get away when we did. And the scariest part, I've never gone camping again. We decided to go camping in the woods, a group of 4 of us, looking for an escape from the noise of the city. We'd set up our tents by a stream and spent the day hiking, laughing, and swimming. The kind of carefree joy that only comes with the silence of nature. But that night, everything changed. As the sun set, we built a campfire and roasted marshmallows. The air was still, the kind of stillness that feels unnatural. As the fire crackled, we heard something soft, almost too soft to notice, a rustling from the direction of the trees. We paused, and for a moment, everything felt off. "Did you hear that?" Jake asked, his voice low. I nodded. We all listened, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. It was then that we saw it, a figure, barely visible against the darkness of the forest. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a shadow moving in the distance, but the shape didn't move like a human. It was too fluid, too wrong. "Probably a deer," I said, trying to laugh it off. But none of us seemed convinced. We stayed by the fire for a while longer, talking to mask the unease. But the wrestling didn't stop. It circled us, getting closer each time, as if whatever was out there was getting braver. Finally, we decided to go to bed, each of us retreating to our separate tents. But sleep didn't come easy. I was lying in my sleeping bag, staring at the ceiling of my tent, when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. It came from outside, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. "Help me!" My blood ran cold. I froze, listening for more. Nothing. Was it a voice? Or the wind? I cautiously unzipped my tent, peeking out into the dark. There was nothing. No one. I was about to zip it back up when I saw something. Not a person, but a shape, barely visible under the cover of night. It was moving slowly, crawling on all fours toward our campsite. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I wake the others? What if it was dangerous? I quickly zipped the tent shut and lay there, my breath shallow, until I heard a soft tap against the canvas. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the whine. Tap. The sound came again, followed by a low growl. I held my breath. The growling was coming from just outside my tent. I was frozen, terrified to make a sound. What was it? It didn't sound like an animal, more like a person, but distorted. I grabbed my phone, trying to turn on the flashlight, but it wouldn't work. The screen flickered, then went black. Panic set in. I had to get out of there. I slowly unzipped the tent, keeping as quiet as I could. The moonlight barely illuminated the clearing, but I could still see the dark shape just a few feet away from me. It was kneeling, its body trembling in a way that was unnatural. Its head snapped toward me. I gasped and slammed the tent flap shut, my heart racing. But then I heard something else. The voice again. But now, it wasn't just one whisper. It was multiple voices, all speaking at once. "Help us, please, they're coming." I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I had to get out. I tried to wake Jake and the others, but none of them were answering. The voices grew louder, and the ground beneath my tent began to tremble as if something huge was moving underneath. And then it hit me, everything I had thought was a whisper, a rustle, a figure in the dark wasn't outside. It was inside. It wasn't a monster from the woods. It was us, trapped, confused. The whispers weren't coming from outside the tent. They were coming from inside the fabric. I scrambled to unzip my tent, not knowing what I would find. The others were awake now, panicking too. Looking around, their faces pale with fear. We stumbled out of our tents, our eyes darting around. We were no longer in the forest. The trees had vanished, and we stood in the middle of a dark, empty field. The sky above us was black and oppressive, the stars dim. Something snapped behind us, a loud crack of dry wood. We turned around and saw what I can only describe as a mass of dark, tangled branches, creeping toward us like fingers from the ground. Then the voices returned, clearer now, but they weren't speaking to us anymore. They were speaking through us. In my mind, in my body, we never leave. The branches reached out, brushing against our legs. It felt cold, sharp, like something dead. The ground started to shake again, and for a brief second, I thought we were back at the campsite. But I turned and saw the fire still burning, far off in the distance. Then, the voices stopped. We were alone, back in the forest. I've never been one to believe in things that go bump in the night. Ghost stories, strange noises, and eerie happenings. They've always been things I laughed off, shrugged at, or chalked up to the wind or some animal rustling around in the trees. That changed the weekend, my friends, and I decided to camp in a secluded area deep in the woods. It was early autumn, the air crisp with that first bite of cold. We picked the spot because it was far from the usual trails, tucked between two ridges where the trees grew so thick that sunlight barely made it to the forest floor. Perfect for a weekend away, or so we thought. The first night was peaceful enough. We set up our tents, got a fire going, and spent hours talking and laughing. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air as the evening shadows grew longer. The deeper we ventured into the woods, the more remote it felt, and though we joked about how alone we were, there was an odd feeling of unease that hung in the air. We brushed it off, of course, the typical chatter of, "It's just the woods, and nothing's out here." But as we lay in our tents that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sounds of the forest seemed amplified in the stillness. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt too deliberate, too close. I tried to ignore it, but my heart raced with each strange noise. I must have dozed off eventually, though I kept waking in the dark, listening, waiting for the next sound. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching the dry leaves outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't sure if the others were awake, but I could hear a faint rustling in their tents, as if they'd heard it too. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing for what felt like minutes at a time. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling, but before I could move, a voice rang out from the darkness. "Get out here." It was faint, but clear. A low, gravelly voice that sounded almost like it was coming from under the ground. I gripped the flashlight harder, my pulse pounding in my ears. We had come far into the woods, far enough that no one should be out there. At this hour. Not near us. I waited for a response from my friends, but the camp was unnervingly quiet. The footsteps resumed, but now they sounded closer, much too close. I felt my skin crawl as they circled the tent again, stopping directly at the entrance. I couldn't stay there any longer. I unzipped the flap of the tent, and for a split second, I saw something, a dark shape, hunched low, standing in the distance just beyond the circle of firelight. It was tall, but unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed to stretch out from its body in odd angles. I froze, barely daring to breathe, watching the shape shift slightly as though it were moving in the shadows. I jumped to my feet and yanked my friends out of their tents, whispering urgently, "We need to go. Now!" They were disoriented, but we gathered what little we could and bolted toward the trail. The forest felt alive with sounds now. The wind seemed to howl, and branches cracked underfoot like they were being crushed. Every step we took felt like something was just behind us, getting closer. But when we dared look back, we saw nothing. The shape I had seen was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of the woods, where the trees finally started to thin. We made it to the clearing, gasping for air, hearts racing in the moonlight. But, as we caught our breath and tried to calm down, we noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones leading toward our campsite from the very spot where the strange footsteps had been earlier. They weren't animal tracks, but human, barefoot, and they were deep, like someone had been standing there for hours. But here's the thing that made my stomach drop. When we checked our tents, everything was exactly as we had left it. Nothing was disturbed. Our gear, our bags, even the food we had left out was untouched. It was as if whoever or whatever had followed us hadn't been there at all. We packed up in silence, all of us eager to get as far from that spot as possible. No one spoke a word about the strange footprints until much later. We never went back to that area, and for the first time in my life, I couldn't laugh off the idea that something was out there, something waiting. Years later, I came across an old map of the area. It was an archive map that marked the trail we had used, but what made my skin crawl was the label on the spot we had camped. It wasn't marked as a campsite or a trailhead. Instead, it was simply labeled, "Do not enter." It was as though someone knew. Just a few friends in the woods for some camping, hiking, and stargazing. Nothing out of the ordinary. But by the end of that trip, I'll never look at the woods the same way again. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, the kind of perfect weather where the sun was low in the sky, casting a golden glow over everything. We set up camp near a quiet stream, the sound of running water soothing against the chirps of crickets. There were 4 of us, all in our mid-20s, Sarah, Jason, Mark, and me. We were all excited, talking and laughing while we unpacked. As evening rolled in, we started a fire, the orange glow flickering against the growing darkness. Sarah had brought a deck of cards. So, we began playing a game, while Mark roasted marshmallows. The forest around us felt peaceful, serene, and we had no reason to think anything would go wrong. That's when the first thing happened. It started with a strange noise. A rustling, like something heavy brushing against the trees. We paused mid-laugh, listening. It was coming from behind us, deeper into the woods. Probably just an animal, Jason said, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling that had settled over us. But then the noise came again. This time, it was closer. I stood up, a little on edge. "Do you think it's a bear? We're fine?" Mark said, waving it off. Bears are usually scared of people. I didn't feel reassured. But as Sarah and Jason continued their card game, I forced myself to sit back down. The noise stopped as abruptly as it started. Night came quickly, and with it, a bone-chilling cold. We huddled around the fire, the crackling flames casting shadows in every direction. That's when I noticed something odd. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the firelight, there was movement. Figures, dark, vague shapes that shifted between the trees. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my breath catching in my throat. Sarah didn't even look up. "Probably deer," she said dismissively. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My eyes kept darting to the shadows, expecting to see something or someone moving just out of view. At some point, we all went to bed. Our tents pitched just far enough apart that we had privacy, but still close enough to hear each other. The wind picked up in the night, whistling through the trees, making every creak and groan of the forest feel like something was creeping closer. I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, that rustling sound. This time, it was unmistakable, the heavy movement of something large and deliberate. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the fabric of the tent above me. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed right outside. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay still. Suddenly, there was a sharp scratching at the side of my tent. My breath caught in my throat. It was deliberate, slow, like something with claws was testing the fabric. I wanted to scream, to yell for my friends, but I couldn't. I didn't dare move. The scratching stopped, and then the worst part came, a voice soft and chilling, like it was right next to my ear. It whispered my name. My blood ran cold. I didn't answer, not even a breath. I held my breath, listening for any further sound, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears. Then, without warning, the tent flap whipped open, sending a blast of cold air inside. I screamed. It was Mark, his eyes wide and panicked, his face pale. Get out of the tent. We didn't question him. We scrambled out, half-dressed, into the cold night air. The fire was out, and the woods around us felt unnaturally silent. Jason, always the skeptic, muttered, "What the hell's going on, man?" "I swear to God," Mark said, shaking, "I saw something outside. It wasn't human." We huddled together, staring into the dark, waiting for some sign of what Mark had seen. That's when we heard it again, the rustling, the snapping of twigs, the whispering voice. This time clearer. It was coming from all around us. That's when Sarah gasped. She pointed to the trees. There, in the distance, just past the tree line, were dozens of pale faces staring back at us. Their eyes were wide, their mouths hanging open, frozen in a strange expression of fear or pain. They weren't human. They were something else. I don't remember how we made it back to the car. All I know is that when we finally pulled out of that forest, we didn't look back. Not once. It wasn't until we were home that I realized something disturbing. That night, when we were huddling by the fire, I had noticed something strange on Sarah's hand. A small mark, almost like a scratch. It was gone the next day, as if it had never been there at all. But when I looked at her hand again later, when we were all back in the safety of our homes, the mark was back, a long, thin line, like a scratch from a claw, only this time, it was moving. I've been a park ranger for nearly 6 years, and I thought I'd seen it all: storm damage, lost hikers, even some wildlife encounters that had me on edge. But nothing prepared me for that night. It started like any other shift, checking the park's trailheads and ensuring the campsites were properly maintained. The forest here is dense, old, and a bit eerie, but it's nothing I couldn't handle. I had just finished my rounds and was heading back to the station when my radio crackled to life. "Ranger, you there?" It was one of the other rangers, a younger guy named Thomas, who'd been working for less than a year. "Yeah, what's up?" I replied, adjusting the radio. "There's someone out here, just past the old ranger station on the Eastern Trail. I've been calling out, but I think they're ignoring me." I frowned. The area he mentioned was remote, and not many hikers ventured there. It was known for its overgrown paths and decaying structures, not the kind of place anyone would choose to be alone, especially as dusk was settling in. "I'll head over," I said. "Stay put until I get there." I drove my truck down the winding road, the sun barely hanging onto the horizon. The trees were thick, their trunks dark and twisted. As I approached the old ranger station, my headlights caught the faded, weathered sign. I slowed down, scanning the area with my high beams. There was no sign of Thomas. I parked the truck and stepped out, immediately feeling the cool, damp air that carried a strange stillness. The kind of stillness that makes you uncomfortable. I switched on my flashlight and began walking toward the station. I was still calling out for Thomas, but the deeper I went into the woods, the more the silence seemed to press in on me. I made it to the station and found it just as desolate as I remembered: dulled wood, crumbling brick, and broken windows. I shined the flashlight around the area, but saw no sign of anyone. Then, something caught my attention. A footprint, fresh and large, was embedded in the mud just outside the door. I froze. The ground had been soft from recent rain, and the footprint was unmistakable to clear to be from an animal, but too large to be a normal human print. My heartbeat quickened, but I pushed the thought out of my head. I needed to find Thomas. I walked through the station, my boots echoing in the hollow space. The air inside was damp, with a faint, musty smell. That's when I heard it. A rustling sound, like something moving in the next room. My hand went to the flashlight, and I flicked the beam toward the noise. Nothing. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. But as I entered the next room, I froze in place. There, sitting in the far corner, was Thomas. He was facing the wall, unmoving, his head down. "Thomas," I called out softly, my voice shaking. I stepped closer, but he didn't respond. I felt a wave of unease wash over me, but I crouched down next to him, trying to get his attention. That's when I noticed that his skin was pale, to pale, and his eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring at the floor. But there was something wrong with his eyes. They were completely white, no pupils, just blank. I jerked back, suddenly terrified. "Thomas, hey, what the hell is going on?" His head slowly turned toward me, but it wasn't Thomas anymore. His mouth stretched unnaturally wide, the edges cracking, as though something inside him had torn. His lips pulled back, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. My legs hit a piece of debris on the floor, sending a loud crack through the air. That was when the thing, whatever it was, lunged at me. I barely managed to roll out of the way, my heart slamming in my chest. The thing, it wasn't Thomas. It was something else entirely, mimicking him, using his body like a puppet. I scrambled to my feet, fear surging through me. The flashlight was still in my hand, but it had slipped from my grip, and now the light was weak, flickering. I bolted out of the station, not daring to look back. The forest seemed to close in around me, every branch and tree whispering in the wind. I ran faster, adrenaline coursing through my veins, but as I reached the truck, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I slammed the door shut and started the engine, peeling out of the station's lot. My hand shook on the wheel as I raced back to the main ranger station. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, my stomach twisted. There, standing in the road behind me, was Thomas, his blank white eyes staring right at me. The last thing I remember, before I drove away, was seeing that figure disappear into the darkness, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. I don't know who or what I saw that night, but the rangers all agreed. Thomas had left the station hours ago, and there was no way he could have made it out there before me. That thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for me. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a break from the grind. My friends and I rented a secluded cabin in the woods, far from civilization, expecting nothing more than fresh air and quiet nights. What we got was far from peaceful. We arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping behind the trees when we unloaded our gear. The cabin looked like something out of a horror movie, old, with peeling paint and a crooked porch. But it was spacious and isolated, and we were eager to escape our hectic lives. The first night was uneventful. We cooked, laughed, and played games around the fire pit. The woods were quiet, almost a quiet. A strange kind of stillness hung in the air, but I thought nothing of it. It was just the isolation. Around midnight, we decided to head inside. I was in the bedroom on the second floor, alone. The others had their own rooms, and I preferred the privacy. I could hear them talking downstairs, but their voices were soon drowned out by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard a faint scratching noise. It was soft at first, almost like a branch tapping against the window. But it didn't stop. It grew louder, more rhythmic, like something or someone was scraping at the wall outside. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind or an animal, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed deliberate, as if it were trying to get my attention. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I sat up in bed, listening. It was closer now, right outside the window. A loud thud made me jump. Then came a voice, soft, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Let me in." I froze. The voice wasn't clear, but it was close. Too close. I rushed to the window, my heart pounding, and pressed my face to the glass. The night was pitch black, no moon, no stars. I saw nothing, only shadows and trees. But the voice came again, clearer this time. "Let me in." I backed away from the window, terrified. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. I was alone upstairs, and the rest of my friends were downstairs, too far away to hear anything. What if it was someone playing a prank? But the voice sounded wrong, too low, too guttural. I grabbed my phone to call one of my friends, but I had no signal. Panic crept in as the voice came again, this time with a low, scraping laugh. I was paralyzed with fear. Should I check outside? Should I wake everyone up? I stayed still, straining to hear any sound, but everything fell silent. No wind, no scratching, nothing. I waited in the dark, my ears ringing with the silence. But after what felt like an eternity, the voice came once more, only this time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the room. I heard a faint rustling behind me, and I spun around to face the door. The door was slightly ajar, as I had left it when I went to bed. But now, the space between the door and the frame was too wide, like something was pushing it open from the other side. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I heard the scraping again, this time from the far corner of the room, near the closet. My legs moved before I could even think, and I bolted from the room, down the stairs, and into the living room where the others were still gathered, oblivious to what had happened. I rushed in, shutting the door behind me. I couldn't speak at first, just gasping for air. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, looking at me with concern. I heard something. Someone outside the window, then inside. I stammered. I could see that my face was pale, and I knew I was shaking. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked skeptically. "You probably just heard an animal. You're freaking out," but I wasn't so sure. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We all stayed up for the rest of the night, but nothing else happened. The wind had died down, and the air felt thick, oppressive, like the cabin was holding its breath. By morning, I convinced myself it was all my imagination. That morning, as we prepared to leave, I noticed something strange. There were long, scratch-like marks on the windowsill. I bent down to look closer, and to my horror, I saw that the marks weren't made by any animal. They were human-shaped, like fingers dragging down the wood. The others didn't notice, and I didn't want to scare them, so I didn't say anything. But as we walked out, I saw the final detail, a handprint pressed against the glass from the outside, smeared with something dark. We left the cabin quickly, and I didn't look back. But to this day, I can't forget that voice, those eyes I never saw, and the feeling that something followed us out of that place. And sometimes, when the wind picks up, I swear I hear a faint whisper, calling me from the dark. A few years ago, I went on a weekend getaway with some friends to a cabin deep in the woods. It was meant to be a relaxing retreat from the chaos of our daily lives. The place was remote, no cell service, no distractions, just a small, rustic cabin and the forest surrounding us. My friends were all excited, but I had a strange feeling as soon as we arrived. The cabin was old, the kind of place that creaked and groaned in the night, but the air felt thick, like it was holding something back. I tried to shake off the feeling, thinking it was just nerves, but something wasn't right. We spent the day hiking and chatting around the campfire. The evening came, and we all gathered in the cabin, laughing and drinking. But around midnight, the atmosphere changed. The air grew heavy and quiet. No crickets, no breeze, just silence. I was sitting near the window when I noticed it, a shadow. At first, I thought it was just the trees moving in the wind, but when I looked closer, I saw that it was too still. And then it moved. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. But the shadow was definitely there. It was a figure standing just outside the window, barely visible in the dark. My heart jumped, and I quickly looked away, trying to shake off the unease. But I couldn't. The others were oblivious, caught up in their conversation. But I couldn't stop thinking about that figure. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I heard a soft tap on the window. I froze. My friends continued talking, unaware, but the tap came again. Faint, slow, as if someone was gently knocking on the glass. I jumped up and pulled the curtains shut, my breath shallow. The others glanced at me, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to sound crazy. The tapping stopped after a while, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was outside. I tried to relax and join the conversation, but the quiet around the cabin was unsettling. Every now and then, I thought I heard something, footsteps, twigs breaking, soft whispers in the distance. I kept glancing out the window, but the darkness held nothing but the looming trees. When we decided to head to bed, I couldn't sleep. The sounds outside the cabin had grown louder. It was as if something was pacing around the house. I pulled the blanket over my head, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. But then there was a knock, soft, at first, Then louder. It wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the ceiling. My heart nearly stopped. The knock echoed through the cabin, like something or someone was in the attic. I had to check. Slowly, I got out of bed and tiptoed into the hallway. I stood frozen for a moment, listening. The knocking continued, methodical, like it was trying to get my attention. I gathered all the courage I had and crept up the stairs to the attic. The air was colder, and I could feel my skin prickle with every step. The door to the attic was ajar, just slightly. I slowly pushed it open, my breath catching in my throat. Inside was a dusty, empty space. But there, on the floor, was something that shouldn't have been there, a footprint. A muddy, human-sized footprint. I quickly stepped back and slammed the door shut. I couldn't explain it. I went back to my room and locked the door, not daring to go outside or tell anyone. It wasn't until the next morning that I told my friends about the sounds. They were skeptical at first, but then we checked the attic. There were more footprints, all around the space. They didn't look like they'd been there long, like someone had been walking around up there, moving things. We immediately decided to leave. We packed up and drove back to town. But as we were leaving the property, something made my blood run cold. The window. The same window where I'd seen the figure earlier. It was wide open. The lock was still in place, but the window had been opened from the inside. I can't explain it. The cabin was supposed to be empty when we arrived. There were no signs of anyone having been there before. But someone or something had been watching us the entire time, lurking just out of sight, waiting. We never went back to that cabin. I still have nightmares about the knocking, the footsteps, and that damn window. But the worst part, I still don't know who or what had been in that attic. The only thing I'm sure of is that it wasn't human. Just a few friends heading into the woods for a weekend of hiking, campfires, and stargazing. We had chosen a remote spot deep in the forest, far from the usual tourist trails. The kind of place you only find if you're looking for it, and where the only sounds are the wind and the birds. We arrived just before dusk, the air thick with the scent of pine. It was beautiful, calm, and entirely untouched. We set up camp near a clearing. There was a small creek running through it, its water dark and swift. We didn't think much of it at first. We were laughing, unpacking, and excited to get the fire going. Everything felt normal, even peaceful. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The fire crackled, casting long, flickering shadows on the trees around us. After a while, we noticed something strange. The woods, which had been so quiet earlier, seemed to quiet now. The usual sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, had vanished. It was unsettling, the way the night felt so unnaturally still. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing. But my friends noticed it too, and the unease grew. We huddled closer to the fire, exchanging nervous jokes to try and lighten the mood. But no one really felt like laughing anymore. That's when we heard the first noise. It came from deeper in the woods, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot, deliberate and slow. It was too regular, too rhythmic, as though something was pacing around the perimeter of our camp. We froze, staring at each other, unsure of what to do. At first, we thought it might be an animal, but this didn't feel like the movement of any creature we knew. The noise stopped, and for a few moments, all we could hear was the crackling of the fire and our own breaths. Then, a voice. It was faint but distinct, just on the edge of hearing, like it was coming from somewhere beyond the firelight. Leave. The word was soft, almost a whisper, but it was clear. We all looked at each other, our faces pale under the flickering light. None of us had spoken. It wasn't one of us. One of my friends, the most practical among us, grabbed his flashlight and stood up. "I'll check it out," he said, trying to sound brave. But his voice was shaking, and we all knew he was scared. We followed him, though none of us wanted to. We walked to the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew thick and dark. The beam of the flashlight swept over the forest floor, catching only shadows and the occasional glint of something reflective eyes. Maybe, but we couldn't be sure. The air felt heavy, thick, like it was pressing down on us. Then, the flashlight flickered and died. Panic set in immediately. We all pulled out our phones, but of course, there was no signal. It felt like the forest was swallowing us whole. I wanted to turn back, but something kept me frozen. The silence returned. Then came the whisper again, clearer this time, as if it was directly behind us. Leave. Now, we spun around, our hearts racing, but there was nothing there. Just trees, just the night. We didn't stay long after that. We packed up quickly, more frantic than I'd ever seen any of us. The hike back to the car was silent, the eerie feeling of being watched never leaving us. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made our hearts skip a beat. We didn't stop until we reached the car, where we drove straight back to civilization. We didn't talk about it much afterward. None of us really wanted to. We told ourselves it had just been our imaginations running wild, that it was all just nerves and the dark playing tricks on us. But I know what I heard. A week later, I received a message from one of my friends. It was a picture, a blurry image of a tree. But in the corner, barely visible, was a figure, tall, shadowy shape, standing in the same spot where we'd heard the whispering. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the figure in the photo was facing the camera, and in the place where its face should have been, there was nothing, just empty space. I've been camping for years, and I've never encountered anything like this. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me and a couple of friends, out in the woods to disconnect. We'd set up camp early in the afternoon. Our spot was isolated, the kind of place where you can hear every rustle in the trees, the chirp of crickets, the crackling of the campfire. The perfect place for a peaceful night away from the world. It started out like any other camping trip. We cooked over the fire, told stupid stories, and laughed about old times. But then, as the fire began to die down and the night deepened, a strange tension settled over the camp. Something was off. The woods had fallen unnervingly silent. Even the crickets stopped chirping. The only sound was the occasional crackle from the fire. I tried to shake off the growing unease. It wasn't like we were alone. My friends were right there with me, just a few feet away. But then, out of nowhere, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I froze, my eyes scanning the darkness. It wasn't coming from anyone in the group. It sounded like it was coming from further into the woods, deeper than we had ventured. I stood up, telling myself it was probably the wind, or maybe an animal. But as I glanced at my friends, I could see they were unsettled too. One of them, let's call him Alex, turned to me and whispered, "Did you hear that?" His voice was tight with unease. Before I could answer, there was a sudden crash from the underbrush behind us, followed by a low, guttural growl. We all snapped our heads toward the sound. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the clearing. It was impossible to see anything in the dark beyond the circle of light. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. None of us spoke for a moment, the silence hanging thick. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move fast, darting between the trees. I couldn't make out any details, just a blur of motion. It was big, though, bigger than any animal I'd seen in these woods. Something about its movements seemed unnatural. My heart started to race. I wasn't one for getting scared easily, but this was different. Whatever was out there, it wasn't normal. The forest had gone from eerie to terrifying in a heartbeat. We huddled closer together by the fire, the warmth of the flames doing little to ease the dread crawling up my skin. We tried to convince ourselves it was just an animal, maybe a bear, or even a bobcat. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I was that whatever it wasn't any animal I knew. Just then, Alex stood up, his face pale. He pointed into the woods, his voice trembling. "Do you see that?" We all turned to follow his gaze. There, just beyond the edge of the firelight, was a figure, tall, impossibly thin, and just standing there. It was completely still, watching us. The only thing visible was the outline of its body, cloaked in darkness. No face, no eyes, just an inhuman silhouette. My pulse shot into my throat. We should have run, right then, but we couldn't move. We were paralyzed, frozen in place by the sheer terror of the thing in front of us. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. Minutes passed hours, it seemed, but the figure remained. Then, without warning, it stepped forward, moving impossibly fast. It was on the edge of the firelight, so close I could feel the weight of its presence, and I could have sworn I saw the faintest glimmer of pale skin beneath the darkness. It was not a shadow. It was a person, a thing. And it was moving toward us. Suddenly, the figure was gone. Vanished, like it had never been there at all. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears as I scanned the woods, expecting it to reappear at any moment, but nothing. Just the eerie silence. We spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, talking in hushed voices, too terrified to sleep, too frightened to leave. It wasn't until dawn that we dared venture out, and we found no sign of the figure, no trace of what had happened. We packed up quickly, eager to get out of those woods, but there was something I couldn't shake, something that gnawed at the edges of my mind. We were all shaken, but as we left, something hit me, something I hadn't noticed before. One of the tents, the one Alex had been sleeping in, was torn wide open, and right in the center of it was a single, deep, fresh footprint shaped like a human's, but the toes were unnaturally elongated. There was no sign of Alex. He had never been in the tent. No one had. I haven't gone back to those woods, and I'm still not sure if Alex was ever really there with us at all. Camping in the deep woods had always been my escape, a chance to disconnect from the chaos of life. I often went with a group of friends, but this time, I found myself alone. The plan was simple: set up camp, enjoy the quiet of nature, and maybe indulge in a little stargazing. Little did I know how the night would unfold. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset, a perfect spot nestled between tall pines and a clear, babbling brook. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves, almost as if nature was welcoming me. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and prepared some snacks as the sky shifted from orange to deep indigo. As darkness settled in, the forest transformed. The sounds of the day faded, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I pulled out my phone to check for service, but there was nothing, just a blank screen. I chuckled at my lack of foresight. No calls, no texts, just me and the wilderness. After a few hours of sitting by the fire, I decided to take a walk. I wandered along the edge of the brook, the water shimmering under the moonlight. Everything felt peaceful until I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound echoed through the trees. I froze, straining to identify the source. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. The sound was similar to someone lightly banging a stick against a tree. Curious, I decided to follow it. As I moved deeper into the woods, the tapping grew louder, and with it came an unsettling feeling that made my skin prickle. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. An uncomfortable silence enveloped the area, the usual sounds of the forest replaced by an eerie stillness. My heart raced as I stood there, adrenaline coursing through me. I turned back toward the campsite, but paused when I caught a glimpse of something between the trees. A figure, cloaked in shadow, stood still, its head tilted slightly as if observing me. I squinted, trying to make out any features, but it was just a dark silhouette. Panic surged within me, and I took a step back. The figure moved, its outline blurring as it stepped further into the darkness, disappearing completely. I turned on my heel and ran back to the fire, my pulse pounding in my ears. I collapsed into my camping chair, trying to calm my racing heart. I reassured myself that it was probably just an animal, but the fear gnawed at me. The fire crackled loudly, illuminating the surrounding trees and keeping the darkness at bay, but my unease lingered. After a few minutes, I mustered the courage to poke the fire and try to shake off the dread. Just as I did, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. My heart sank. I grabbed the flashlight, shining it toward the sound. Nothing. I felt like a child again, afraid of the monsters lurking in the dark. As I sat there, a movement caught my eye from the corner of the clearing. A figure emerged from the trees, this time much closer. I stood up abruptly, ready to confront whatever it was. The flashlight beam revealed a woman, pale and disheveled, her eyes wide with terror. She raised her hands, trembling. "Please help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "What happened?" I asked, stepping forward. "They're coming for me," she stammered, looking over her shoulder. "I don't know what they want, but they won't stop." My instincts kicked in, and I gestured for her to sit by the fire. "You're safe here." "Who is coming?" Just then, I heard it again, the rhythmic tapping, now closer than before. The woman's eyes widened further, and she let out a small whimper. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I glanced into the darkness, the tapping now turning into a chorus of discordant knocks. Suddenly, the fire flickered violently, as if something had passed through the light. I turned to look at the woman, but she had vanished. My heart dropped, and I stumbled back, casting the flashlight all around me. I felt the ground shift beneath my feet, the world tilting as panic set in. Then I heard her voice, echoing from the darkness. "They're here." I stumbled back to the tent, desperate to escape whatever was haunting me. As I unzipped the door and stepped inside, I took a breath to steady myself. I closed my eyes, hoping to wake up from this nightmare. When I opened them, the scene had changed. My campsite was now empty, devoid of any trace of my tent or the fire. All that remained was a crude drawing etched into the dirt where my campfire once burned. It reads simply, "We will find you." I stumbled back, realizing I wasn't alone. The rhythmic tapping returned, echoing through the trees, but this time I was not the one being hunted. I had become part of their twisted game, and the night was just beginning. As a park ranger, I had seen my fair share of strange occurrences in the deep woods, but nothing could prepare me for what happened on that chilly October evening. It was the end of the camping season, and the air was filled with a crispness that hinted at the winter to come. I was on patrol, ensuring the last few campers packed up and left before dark. I was nearing a secluded part of the park when I noticed a flickering light through the trees. Curious, I veered off the trail, thinking it might be a camper who had lost their way. The forest grew denser as I approached, and the sunlight dimmed. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one where the shadows loomed heavier and the air turned thick with tension. As I crept closer, I saw a tent. The glow of a lantern inside flickered rhythmically, casting ghostly shadows. I called out, but there was no response. I cautiously stepped up to the tent and unzipped the flap. Inside was a family: mom, dad, and 2 kids, all huddled together, fear etched on their faces. I asked what was wrong, and they glanced at each other, their eyes wide. The father spoke in a hushed tone, saying they heard strange noises outside. At first, they thought it was just the wind, but as the night progressed, it grew more unsettling. He mentioned hearing what sounded like whispers and the rustling of leaves. But then came the worst part. Just before I arrived, they saw a shadow pass by their tent, something tall and thin, that walked onto legs, but didn't look entirely human. I tried to reassure them, telling them it was probably just a deer or another animal. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I suggested they pack up and follow me back to the ranger station. They agreed, relieved to leave the tent behind. As we began to gather their things, I noticed something strange outside. The whispering had returned. It was a low, unintelligible sound, echoing from the depths of the trees. The family froze, their eyes darting around, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but all I could see was the black expanse of trees. The whispers grew louder, swirling around us like an angry wind. I told everyone to stay close and led them away from the tent, my heart racing. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from behind us. We turned to see the lantern flicker violently before going dark. Panic surged through the family as I pushed them to move faster. We trudged through the underbrush, branches snagging at our clothes, the whispers following us, echoing like a taunt. The feeling of being haunted crept into my bones. We reached the trail, and relief flooded over me as we emerged into the dim light of dusk. I hurried the family along the path, keeping an eye over my shoulder. That's when I saw it. A tall, gaunt figure stood at the edge of the trees, its eyes glowing like embers in the fading light. My blood ran cold as the whispers shifted to a chilling laughter that made my stomach churn. I urged the family to keep moving, and we hurried down the path, adrenaline pumping through my veins. We finally reached the ranger station, where I quickly ushered them inside. As I locked the door behind us, I glanced back out into the woods. The figure was gone, but the laughter lingered, an echo that hung in the air. After the family calmed down, I began to explain what had happened, hoping to downplay the fear. But just then, the radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. It was another ranger reporting strange noises and shadows seen near a different campsite. My heart dropped as the realization hit me there were more campers in danger. I turned to the family and promised them they would be safe inside while I went to assist. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had interrupted something that shouldn't be disturbed, something that was now angry at us for our intrusion. As I ventured back into the woods, The laughter returned, taunting me. I followed the sounds. Each step felt like a descent into madness. The trees closed in around me, and suddenly I tripped over a root, tumbling to the ground. When I looked up, the figure loomed over me, closer than before. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back toward the station. Bursting through the door, I slammed it shut and locked it, breathing heavily. I turned to find the family staring at me, their faces pale. But behind them, in the shadows, stood the very same figure that had chased us. Its eyes flickered in the dim light, a sinister grin spreading across its face. And in that moment, I understood the truth. The woods were alive, and it would always have a way to reclaim what was taken from it. The laughter echoed in my ears, and I knew we had merely survived a night in its domain. But as long as we remained vigilant, perhaps we could outlast its terrifying grasp.